Hey guys, tonight we're bundling up for something a little different. A slow, icy drift into the frozen heart of the Wild West. Not the romanticised one with showdowns at high noon and dusty saloons, but the quieter, grimmer version. Winter's so cold your spit freezes before it hits the ground, and the only thing standing between you and the frost is a leaky log cabin and maybe a half-dead fire. This is survival history, the stuff that never made it into the glamorous cowboy posters. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps more than you know. And hey, while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from and what time it is over there. It's kind of fun seeing where and when everyone's tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open the door of your one-room homestead and get slapped in the face by a wind so sharp it might as well be carrying tiny daggers. There's snow piled against the threshold, stacked high like someone's playing a joke. You knew winter was going to be bad this year, but it's barely December, and already your nose hairs are freezing solid just from breathing. Out on the plains, the wind doesn't care about your feelings. It howls like some ancient starving god, screaming across hundreds of miles of open grassland. You step back inside, pull the door shut behind you with effort. It swells in the cold and sticks like it's got its own opinion, and try not to think about the fact that there are at least 3 more months of this. The cabin isn't exactly cosy. Sure, it looks fine from the outside like something out of a sepia-toned photograph, but inside, the cold has made itself a roommate. The gaps between the logs whistle with every gust, and frost creeps in at the corners of the window like it's trying to sneak in quietly. Your breath clouds in the air, visible, like a ghost hanging around your mouth. You make your way over to the small cast-iron stove and poke at the fire with a metal rod that's probably colder than the wind outside. The fire answers back with a sad hiss and a few glowing coals. It's not enough to heat the whole room, not even close. It mostly heats the 3 square feet directly in front of it, but you stand there anyway, trying to catch some warmth on your legs while the rest of your body remains stubbornly frozen. Settlers back then didn't just deal with winter, they endured it, sometimes barely, sometimes not at all. Mortality in frontier winters wasn't a rare thing. Hypothermia wasn't even properly understood, it just happened, and no one had a name for it. You'd hear about it in town. Old Pete froze in his barn last week, and that was that. People took it seriously, of course, but not always with panic. It was just another risk of living out here like rattlesnakes, infected cuts, or bandits. Except this one came in slow, wrapped in silence and frost. Your home isn't insulated. The concept doesn't even exist yet, not really. Maybe you've shoved rags or moss into the gaps between the logs. Maybe you've hung heavy quilts along the walls like people used to do back then, layering fabric to trap whatever body heat didn't immediately try to escape into the ether. Even with all that, you wake up every morning with a layer of frost on your blanket. And yes, that's a real thing. People would find their bedding literally crusted in ice from the moisture in their breath condensing and freezing overnight. And that brings us to one of the lesser known but very real historical oddities of the time: sleeping with your livestock. Not just because you loved your cow, but because cows are giant living space heaters. Horses too. People would bring them into the shelter, sometimes the same room they slept in, or build barns attached directly to the house so that the animal's body heat contributed to keeping everyone alive. A sweaty horse might smell like desperation, but in the dead of winter, it was better than death. Still, warmth was relative. You get used to being cold. It's like this low hum in your bones. Your hands crack, your lips bleed, and you keep moving because if you stop, you start shaking, and if you shake too long, you stop again, and that's when the real danger creeps in. Settlers learned the signs without needing science. Skin that goes numb and hard. A nose that turns white and waxy. They'd say, "You got the frost on you," which meant you better get by that fire fast or start praying. Scholars today still argue about how people really coped. Some say it was sheer grit. Others point out that most settlers didn't live in total isolation. They relied on neighbours, churches and community barns more than we tend to imagine. Winter was a collective threat, and it forced cooperation. But not everyone had that luxury. The further west you went, the thinner the help got. Out in the Dakotas or the Rockies, it might be miles to your nearest neighbour, and that's if your horse didn't break a leg on the ice trying to get you there. Outside, the wind howls louder, as if it knows you're trying to ignore it. It pushes snow through the smallest cracks like it's trying to sneak inside and sit by the fire too. You tuck yourself deeper into your coat. It's fur-lined and smells like wet animal, because it is a wet animal basically, but it's the best you've got. Wool undergarments, leather boots stuffed with straw, mittens sewn from buffalo hide. It's all there, layered on like armour. The only thing exposed is your eyes, and even those sting from the cold. You look around your cabin, and for a brief second you wonder if it'll hold through the night. The logs creak, the wind groans. Somewhere in the distance something crashes, maybe a branch or maybe something larger. Either way, you don't go outside, not tonight. And that's the hard truth most frontier survival stories skip. You probably won't survive this. Not unless you're lucky, tough, and surrounded by just the right combination of fire, furs, food, and stubbornness. But you don't think about that right now. You sit by the fire, watching the coals fade into orange and ash, and hope tomorrow's a little less brutal. You wake up stiff as a wooden plank, curled into yourself like a hibernating animal. The fire went out sometime in the night, of course. The cabin is quiet, but not the good kind of quiet. It's the kind that makes your ears feel hollow, like even sound is too frozen to move. Your blanket crackles as you shift. There's a layer of frost along the edges, sharp and clinging. You'd laugh, but your face hurts when you try. The first thing you do, before you even consider stepping out of bed, is wrap your scarf tighter around your neck and pull your hat down lower. This isn't a casual kind of cold, this is weaponized, unforgiving, bones in a vice kind of cold. The kind that makes you mutter curses just to see your own breath swirl around like pipe smoke. It's time to get dressed. Or rather more dressed. Because let's be real, you went to bed in half your clothes. That was survival 101 back in the Wild West. Never sleep naked in winter unless you've written your will and kissed your mule goodbye. You slept in your wool underthings, your socks, and probably your trousers if they weren't too stiff from the snow you stomped through yesterday. And now you add layers. Another shirt, a thick vest, a coat that smells like horse and campfire, and if you're lucky, a long woolen duster that's seen better decades. Settlers layered up like onions. Wool closest to the body, itchy but warm. Then cotton or linen if you had it. Then hides, deer, elk, buffalo, whatever you could kill, scrape, tan and stitch into a wearable shape. Some folks even greased the inside of their clothes with animal fat. Yeah, that's real. Lard or bear grease was used to waterproof boots, coat mittens, and sometimes rubbed onto skin to block the chill. You'd go to bed smelling like breakfast, but if it meant not losing your fingers to frostbite, you'd do it without a second thought. And then there were the long johns, a staple of winter living that barely changed in design for over a century. They were usually made of wool, buttoned up the front and hung down past your knees. If they were good, they'd last you years. If they were bad, they'd shrink in the wash and turn into itchy shackles. You wore them de souvenir and everything, day and night, until spring said it was safe to come out. Most of the time, you didn't even wash them. The dirt worked like extra insulation. You probably don't want to think too hard about that. You pull on your boots, stiff and crusted with yesterday's snow and lined with whatever was available. Straw, rabbit fur, or crumpled up newspaper if you were desperate. Socks were never enough. The cold knew how to crawl. It always found the gap between your pants and your boots, or the hole in your mitten you'd been meaning to patch. You'd try to outsmart it, but the cold always played the long game. Inside the cabin, you breathe slow, trying to shake off the morning fog. Your breath comes out in puffs again, like you're permanently smoking an invisible cigar. You move over to the stove, the iron still faintly warm. Not enough to help, but enough to remind you it once did. You shovel in some wood, thin dry slivers because it's all you've got, and strike flint to kindling. The spark catches, flickers, and you whisper to it like it's a scared animal. Come on, stay with me. If there's one thing winter taught people out here, it's how to beg fire like it's a god. And honestly, it kind of is. Fire meant food, safety, even hope. It stood between you and the long black hand of the winter night. You didn't just tend fires, you doted on them. Settlers had tricks too, saving coals in ashes overnight so they didn't have to start fresh in the morning. Wrapping stones in cloth to heat the bed before climbing in. Sometimes even baking bread late at night just for the heat it gave off. It wasn't efficient, but it was warm. Ish. You eat something small, hard bread, maybe jerky if it's not frozen solid, beans if you've got any left, and coffee, if you're lucky, a thin, bitter liquid that barely qualifies, but gives you just enough warmth to face the day. You drink it slowly, trying to trick your body into believing this is a civilized morning, not the first trial of an endless frozen gauntlet. The funny part, even with all the clothes, the grease, and the fire, people still froze, because the Wild West wasn't built for comfort. Homes weren't sealed tight, they weren't insulated. A log cabin was basically a pile of sticks with ambition. Gaps between logs were chinked with mud or moss or clay, but cold air still got in like an uninvited dinner guest. Glass was expensive and rare. Some people used greased paper over their windows instead. Imagine trying to keep warm with paper for windows. Even inside, water could freeze in a cup if left out overnight. Pipes? Nope. Buckets, basins, whatever you had. That meant hauling water every morning, even if it was frozen into a solid block. You'd chip it loose, warm it over the fire, and hope it didn't crack the basin from expanding. If you had livestock, they needed water too, and breaking through a crust of ice every morning wasn't a chore, it was survival. Historians today sometimes argue about just how brutal these winters were. Some say we over-romanticize the hardship, that settlers were more resilient and adapted than we give them credit for. Others argue we underestimate how much people suffered and died in ways that weren't always recorded, especially women, children, and the elderly. Diaries tell stories that census records don't. A baby born in February might not survive to April. A man sent out to chop wood might never come back. The cold didn't care about your calendar or your plans, it just took what it wanted. And then there's the strange stuff, the fringe facts, like the occasional settler who swore by sleeping in the hayloft because they believed straw had sun-trapped heat. Spoiler, it didn't. But desperate minds make creative logic. People made mittens out of old socks, sewed newspapers into their jackets, or stuffed their clothes with dried grass to trap body heat. It wasn't fashion, it was function by force. You finish your bitter cup of survival coffee and step outside. The snow crunches beneath your boots with a sound that feels almost satisfying. It's too bright out here, the sun reflecting off the snow like a giant mocking mirror. Your eyelashes stick together from the frost. You squint toward the barn where your mule is probably plotting your death for making him live through another winter. The sky is clear. That's never a good sign. Clear skies in the Wild West winters don't mean warmth. They mean the temperature is about to nosedive. You sigh and pull your scarf tighter. It's just another morning in the icy grip of the West. And somehow, you're still standing. You trudge through the snow toward the cabin's outhouse, and immediately regret every life decision that led to this moment. The wind hits you sideways, like it's personally offended that you dared to open the door. Your boots crunch through the snow, each step sinking in just enough to get snow down the sides. Perfect. You clench your jaw and carry on, because this is life now. Cold, crusty, and too proud to admit it's slowly grinding you down. The outhouse, of course, is not insulated. It's a wooden box perched over a frozen hole, and it feels like entering a tomb made of ice and shame. Everything in there is cold, the air, the seat, the very idea of using it. But here's a grim historical reality. Back then, people had to go outside for every need, and in winter, that wasn't just inconvenient. It could be dangerous. A wrong step on ice, a trip, a fall, and suddenly you're lying out there with no help coming for hours. Settlers had a name for that kind of a death. Stupid preventable, and more common than you'd think. When you get back inside, cheeks numb and patience gone, you stomp your boots by the door and peel off your outer layers like they're made of tree bark. It takes time, layers of animal hide and wool don't exactly slip off like silk, and underneath all of it, you're already starting to sweat. That's the cruel paradox of cold weather. Sweat is your enemy. Once your clothes get damp, they become sponges for the cold. More than one cowboy or pioneer died not from lack of warmth, but from overheating during the day and freezing at night in wet clothes. You settle back into the cabin, and for a minute, it's almost peaceful. The wind moans outside like a far-off train, and inside the fire finally coughs to life again. You crouch near it, palms out, feeling the blessed burn of returning sensation, and you start to realize something that most people today can't quite grasp. A one-room cabin could be both your sanctuary and your prison. There was no privacy, no space to pace, no escape from your own thoughts, or the bodies around you. That's right, you weren't always alone. Most of the time, you were living in that tiny cabin with your whole family. That meant 2, 3, maybe even 6 people crammed into a single room no larger than a modern-day studio apartment. When winter hit, everyone stayed inside. All day, all night. Kids fidgeted, adults tried to keep busy, and the air got stale, smoky, a little too thick with human breath and boiled beans. And when bedtime came, everyone piled into the same bed or onto makeshift pallets next to the stove, wrapped in blankets, furs, and sometimes each other. And here's where it gets real cozy: bed bugs and lice. Winter didn't kill them. In fact, the warm body heat and close quarters practically invited them in for a winter party. People slept in their clothes, sometimes for weeks, and it didn't take long before you were scratching more than just your nose. Parasites were just another fact of life. Unpleasant? Sure. Unavoidable? Mostly. You might dust your bedding with ash or cedar shavings, but that only did so much. Sometimes the only cure was fire, burning the mattress altogether and starting over, if you could afford to. And let's not forget the smoke. That sweet, romantic image of a fire crackling in a log cabin gets a little less charming when you remember that most chimneys weren't properly vented, or they were clogged, or the wind simply blew the smoke right back down into your living space. Your eyes stung, your lungs wheezed, and sometimes you had to open a window in the dead of winter just to stop choking, which of course made the entire cabin cold again. So now you're freezing and crying. Welcome to Frontier Hygge. Not all fires were built the same either. A basic hearth at one end of the cabin might warm the wall behind it, but not much else. The bed on the far side of the room, cold as a crypt. The floor, a frozen slab unless you'd thought ahead and insulated it with straw or extra rugs. Some families built their homes with a stove in the centre of the room, hoping for more even heat. Smart, but not always possible. Stoves were expensive, and if yours broke, good luck fixing it in a snowstorm. You glanced over to the corner of the room where snow has begun to gather. Inside, that's another charming frontier reality. Chinking, the material stuffed between cabin logs to seal out the wind, was never perfect. It might be dried mud, horsehair, straw, or whatever filler you could scrape together. In the summer it cracked and fell out. In the winter the wind worked its way in, dragging snow with it. You could wake up to drifts on your floor, and unless you got up every hour to patch the gaps, they just kept growing. And yet somehow people made it through. Not everyone, sure, but enough. Families passed down stories of winters where the walls groaned, the roof sagged under snow, and food had to be thawed before you could chew it. They spoke of hard freezes, nights so cold that even the whiskey froze, and that's not a joke. Alcohol has a lower freezing point than water, and when the whiskey turned solid, you knew it was bad. Interestingly, there's some debate among historians about how people psychologically handled such confinement. Today we call it cabin fever, but in the 1800s they didn't have a word for the slow unravelling of your mind after weeks without fresh air or personal space. Diaries describe sour moods, or fits of weeping. Others just mention the silence. It's possible some folks experience seasonal affective depression without ever understanding it. You can almost feel it as you sit in this imaginary cabin. The light grey and dim, the windows iced over, the wind endless. The conversations long since run dry, but then you remember there were little joys too, even in the cold, sewing by lamplight, telling stories by the fire, sharing body heat under thick quilts, maybe playing a homemade fiddle or singing songs. And maybe, just maybe, the warmth of other people mattered more than the fire in the stove. Still, as you sit there in your many layers, listening to the wind hurl itself at the cabin walls, you wonder what would happen if you had to do this every winter. Not for one night, or even a week, but month after frozen month. Would you adapt? Would you grow used to the numb fingers, the frost-fringed blankets, the thin food and thinner patience? Or would you snap? But no time to answer that now. You've got firewood to chop before the next storm rolls in. You step outside again, axe in hand, breath clouding in front of your face like some tired dragon. The snow crunches under your boots with that familiar brittle sound, like breaking through a thin sheet of ice over an old memory. You don't even feel the cold anymore. Not really. Just the dull ache of skin too used to it. Your fingers barely register the wooden handle of the axe, and your nose has been numb for so long it might as well belong to someone else. The firewood stack is running low. You knew it would. It always does faster than you think. That's the thing nobody mentions in storybooks about the Wild West. You're not fighting outlaws every day, you're mostly fighting fuel. In winter, wood is currency, and not just any wood. Dry, split, seasoned wood. The kind that doesn't smoke you out of your cabin or hiss like a snake every time you toss it into the stove. You drag the first log onto the stump and bring the axe down hard. The wood splits with a satisfying crack, the sound echoing across the snowbound field like applause for the effort. You keep at it, arms swinging, breath heavy, body slowly warming, not comfortably, but in that survival way. It's work that leaves your back sore and your soul just barely intact. Chopping wood in the winter is less about heating your home and more about not freezing to death. That's not exaggeration. That's the equation. No wood equals no fire equals no you. Back in the cabin, the fire's finally climbing. You can almost hear it humming to itself, a little lullaby of popping sap and shifting coals, but you also know it'll eat through that new wood faster than you'd like. Fires on the frontier weren't gentle companions. They were ravenous beasts, demanding to be fed every few hours. Go too long without tending them, and the cabin went cold. And when the cabin went cold, you risked frostbite in your own bed. Blankets help, of course, and furs. You've got a heavy buffalo robe, a real prize out here, and you pull it over your shoulders like it's royal garb. Buffalo hides were the gold standard of winter bedding on the frontier. Dense, warm, and big enough to cover 2 people, sometimes 3. Indigenous people had used them for generations before settlers caught on. They were the closest thing to central heating you were going to find west of the Mississippi, the fringe benefit. They were durable. You could drag one across snow, wrap it around you during a storm, even sleep directly on it. But they weren't exactly light. Rolling up in one meant staying there. Turning over in bed was more of a commitment than a convenience. Your bed itself is more of a platform than anything. A rough frame of wood with a mattress stuffed with straw if you're lucky. No box springs, no memory foam, just you, the straw, and an ache in your lower back that's starting to feel permanent. You pile the hides high, maybe toss in some quilts made from old clothes. Every settler family had at least one quilt passed down from someone's grandmother, sewn from scraps of whatever wasn't too threadbare to throw away. You lie back and try not to think about how cold your toes still are. The blanket smells like the inside of an animal, which, let's be honest, it is. But it's warm, and warm is everything. You curl up tight, maybe with another body beside you if you're not sleeping alone. In the Wild West winter, body heat wasn't romantic, it was tactical. Whole families often shared one bed, layered together like a human lasagna under hide and wool. And if you had a baby, they slept closest to the fire, or under your coat, or both. But even with all of that, you can still freeze inside your own home. That's the brutal truth. You'd think a fire and some blankets would be enough. Sometimes they weren't. The wind crept in, the walls groaned, and temperatures dropped so low that cabin interiors would dip below freezing overnight. People would wake with ice on their eyelashes, frost on the window panes, on the inside. And more than a few folks simply didn't wake up at all. One woman in an 1887 homesteader diary wrote that she lost feeling in 2 toes during a particularly rough January. She kept it to herself because they didn't look black. And she didn't want to worry her husband. They fell off by March. She mentioned it in the same breath as complaining about the quality of the biscuits that winter. That's the kind of toughness we're talking about here. Practical, grim and unsentimental. The quirky side of all this. There were actual superstitions about the cold. Some folks believed hanging horseshoes over the hearth kept out freezing spirits. Others stuffed small charms under their mattresses, or carried acorns in their coat pockets as a symbol of warmth and protection. Was any of it real? Of course not. But in the long, empty dark of January nights, belief does what fire sometimes can't. It keeps you going. You shuffle back to the fire and add another log. It hisses and then catches, casting flickering orange light against the cabin walls. For a moment, it feels like you've won. Like maybe this winter won't chew you up and spit you out like last year almost did. But then a gust of wind rattles the window and reminds you, this isn't over. It's never over. Not until the thaw. Scholars still debate just how accurate the old winter stories are. Were conditions really that harsh? Did people actually sleep in buffalo robes every night? Or is that just frontier myth-making? Some argue that we inflate the hardship because it fits the rugged pioneer narrative. Others say we downplay it, forgetting that many of these people were dirt poor, unprepared and isolated in ways we can't even fathom today. The truth is probably somewhere in between. What's clear though is that warmth was always borrowed time. You never really got warm out here. You got less cold. That was the goal. And it shaped how you lived, how you moved, even how you thought. You didn't linger, you didn't waste time, you planned your chores around the sun, your nights around the stove, and your sleep around the last embers glow. You turned back toward the bed, your buffalo robe waiting like a heavy cloud. You know the fire won't last till morning. It never does. But for now, there's warmth, there's quiet, and that's enough. There's a lie living in the corner of every frontier home, and it's made of brick and cast iron. You look at your fireplace or stove and think, that'll keep me warm. It won't. At least not like you're hoping. It's not your fault. You've been trained by modern heating systems to believe that if there's a flame, comfort follows. But in the Wild West, fires were liars. They promised warmth and delivered mostly disappointment, with just enough heat to stop you from turning into a meat popsicle. You kneel down in front of the stove again, feeding it more wood like an offering to a stubborn deity. The flames jump up obligingly, licking the iron grate, sending out that brief, seductive heat that kisses your face and disappears before it reaches your shoulders. And then you back away, and instantly you feel the bite. Your back already cold, your toes aching again. You're chasing warmth like a dog chasing its tail. It always stays just out of reach. The truth is, early fireplaces, especially the open hearths of log cabins, were more decorative than practical. The heat mostly went straight up the chimney and out into the sky, leaving behind just enough for you to think it was doing something. The only part of your body that got truly warm was whatever faced the fire directly. You toast the front of your legs, then turn around and toast the back like some sad rotisserie human. And even then the heat faded fast. Move 2 steps away from the hearth, and you were back in the Arctic. People adapted, of course. They built smaller rooms to trap the heat, pushed beds closer to the fire, and shut doors on every other space, turning their homes into a series of cozy tombs. Some cabins didn't even have doors between rooms, just blankets or rugs hung across the openings to keep the warmth from escaping. You learned quickly that heat was a currency you couldn't afford to waste. Every bit mattered. Still, the design of those old stoves and fireplaces was often just bad. You'd think the roaring fire would heat the room, but it mostly heated the space directly around the chimney. The heat would rise, leaving the floorboards freezing. That meant your toes stayed numb, even if your scalp was sweating. In fact, people often got sick from this uneven heating. Sitting too close to the fire, you'd sweat, get damp, and then, the moment you walked away, that moisture would freeze, and you'd end up sicker than before. Fire, your frenemy. Some settlers upgraded to potbelly stoves, those round, squat iron beasts you've seen in 100 old westerns. They were slightly better at radiating heat, especially if placed in the centre of the room, but they still weren't miracle workers. The heat didn't spread evenly. People who slept near them sweated through their nightshirts. Those further away woke up with ice in their beards. Beards, by the way, weren't just facial fashion statements. In the Wild West winter, they were insulation. Men let their beards grow long and thick, not just because razors were hard to come by, but because a frozen beard was better than a frozen jaw. Of course, the flip side was that beards would freeze anyway. The moisture from your breath would gather in your moustache and chin and turn into little icicles. So you'd wake up not only cold, but also wearing a beard popsicle. No one talks about that in the romance novels. There's a fringe belief you remember hearing once, something from a memoir or town tale, that some families used to hang copper kettles above their fireplaces filled with rocks, believing the rocks absorbed heat and remembered it. They'd carry the warm stones to bed, wrap them in cloth and place them at their feet. The idea was that the rock had a kind of loyalty, like if you heated it once it would stay your friend all night. Spoiler, it didn't. The heat bled away quickly, and the rock was just another lump in your bed by dawn. But the belief itself tells you something, how desperate people were to believe in something that might keep them warm longer than a few minutes. In a world where your fingers could turn black overnight and firewood was running out by January, heat was more than comfort. It was hope. If a rock could hold the memory of warmth, then maybe you could hold on to the idea of spring. You sit by the fire now, arms wrapped around your knees, trying to soak in the heat before it fades. Your boots are off, your socks hanging nearby to dry. The room smells like wood smoke, wet wool, and the faintest trace of bacon grease from breakfast. It's not pleasant exactly, but it's homey in its own stubborn way. This room, with its flickering fire and groaning walls, becomes the centre of the world for months. You don't go far, you don't want to go far. Every trip outside is a negotiation. Do I really need more wood? Is the outhouse worth the risk? How bad do I need water? The fire makes those decisions for you. If it's strong and lively, you venture out. If it's low and weak, you huddle close and pretend the outside world doesn't exist. And yet the cold always finds a way in. Through the floorboards, through the gaps in the walls, through the single-pane windows that frost over so thick you could scratch your name into them. Even now, sitting here, you feel it working its way into your bones. You try to shake it off, but it lingers, like a rude house guest who never quite leaves. You remember hearing stories from old-timers, men and women who said they used to sleep with their boots on, not because they were afraid of robbers, but because they were afraid of frozen leather. Wet boots left by the fire might freeze solid overnight, and in the morning you'd need to break them in just to get your foot inside. Imagine trying to start your day by smashing your shoe open with a rock. Some historians argue that people exaggerated these hardships over time, that memories of cold winters grew taller with each retelling, like fish stories. But even if they stretch the truth a little, the core remains: winter was brutal and fire was fickle. It helped you, yes, but it also teased you, gave you just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. And so you sit here, in the glow of the flames, staring into that flickering orange centre, like it holds some secret. It doesn't. But you stare anyway, because it's warm, because it dances, because for a few minutes it makes you forget that there's snow piled 5 feet high outside the door and a storm rolling in over the ridge. The fire hisses, spits a little, then settles into a soft pop and crackle. You don't move, you don't want to lose the spot of heat you've claimed. For now, the fire is winning. For now, the lie is good enough. You chew your breakfast like it wronged you in a past life. Something dry, bland and cold despite sitting 5 inches from the fire. Probably beans, definitely hardtack, maybe a scrap of last fall's smoked venison, if you rationed it well. Everything you eat in winter tastes like a dare. It's not just food, it's a survival calculation. How long can you make this last? How long before it freezes solid again? The Wild West diet in winter was never glamorous. Forget the chuck wagon cookouts and sizzling steaks you've seen in the movies. Most of the time it was whatever hadn't rotted or turned to stone. Canned goods were around, but not widespread. You had to really plan ahead to have anything stored in tin. Otherwise it was root vegetables, beans, jerky, salt pork, cornmeal mush, and whatever scraps you could stretch across the next few weeks. Today's meal was left soaking by the fire overnight, not to marinate, but just so you wouldn't break a tooth biting into it. Cold beans don't even pretend to be appetizing, but they're full of calories, and in winter, calories are currency. Your body burns through fuel like a train engine just trying to keep warm. There's no such thing as overeating when you're living in a freezing log box with air leaks you can see your breath through. You eat with your gloves off, which you instantly regret. The metal spoon bites your fingers with that metallic sting that only happens when cold wraps itself around the marrow of your bones. You switch to your hands, less elegant, more practical. Table manners went out the frosty window a long time ago. Then there's water, or more specifically, the never-ending saga of trying to keep it liquid. You keep a bucket near the stove, but even that forms a layer of ice on top if you're not careful. Every morning starts with cracking the surface like a frozen pond and hoping it doesn't taste like wood smoke and desperation. There's no plumbing. Of course, water is hauled from the well or the nearest creek, sometimes melted snow, though that takes a lot of fuel. Melting enough snow to fill a kettle can take an hour, and in that hour the cabin loses more heat than you'd like to admit. Out on the prairie, water could be scarce in winter. Wells froze, streams vanished beneath layers of ice. Some families collected ice deliberately, storing it in cellars packed with sawdust to insulate it for the warmer months. Others just gave up and drank from wherever they could. Frozen pond, muddy runoff, slush in a hoof print. Bacteria wasn't exactly a known quantity yet. If you got sick, it was bad water or bad luck, or both. A fringe technique from some northern outposts involved heating stones in the fire and dropping them into snow-filled pots to speed up melting. This worked in theory, but you had to be quick. Hot stones could crack iron pots or cause boiling explosions of slush if you dropped them wrong. More than one settler walked around with a burn on their face and a story they never wanted to tell. You take another bite of bean mush and try to ignore the wind screeching outside. It's not just howling, it's yelling. Like it's angry you've survived this long, and it's planning a second attempt. The whole cabin groans in reply, wood shifting under the pressure of air cold enough to snap nails. Somewhere outside you hear something collapse. Hopefully just a tree. Hopefully not your barn. If you had chickens or goats, they're huddled in whatever sad excuse for a shelter you could manage. Livestock was survival, but winter made keeping them alive a full-time job. Animals needed water, food and warmth too. You couldn't just leave them to the elements. You had to break the ice in their troughs twice a day. You had to haul hay through snowdrifts and keep predators from picking them off. Wolves, coyotes, and desperate dogs got bold when the snow got deep. So did mountain lions. And you, with your freezing hands and one-shot rifle with a line between them and your milk goat. Back inside, you scrape the last of your meal from the bowl, wondering if it's worth heating more water for washing up. It's probably not. You set the bowl aside and wipe your hands on your pants like any respectable frontier adult. Hygiene takes a back seat in winter. Cleanliness is nice, warmth is essential. A hot bath, forget it. Most people didn't bathe more than once a month in winter, if that. Not because they didn't want to, but because heating enough water was a luxury no one could afford. Sometimes entire families shared bathwater, oldest to youngest, or father first, then mother, then the kids. By the end, the water was grey and lukewarm, but still better than standing in the snow with a bar of lice open hope. You'd scrub with a cloth maybe, or just rub yourself down with snow if you were feeling ambitious and deeply self-loathing. And food storage. That was the only upside to this never-ending deep freeze. Meat kept perfectly well when hung in the barn or buried in snowbanks. You didn't need a fridge when your backyard was Siberia. A slab of venison could last all winter, assuming the mice didn't get it first, or the bears, or your neighbour. That brings you to an uncomfortable truth. Winter brought out the worst in people. Desperation did strange things. There are scattered stories, some true, some whispered, about theft, betrayal, even cannibalism during harsh winters. The infamous Donner Party was just one example, and while they weren't typical settlers, their story haunted the American imagination. Most families never reached that level of desperation, but they knew the line existed, and they quietly understood how close they sometimes came to it. You sit near the stove again, watching the last flame flutter in the belly of the beast. The cabin is quiet now, save for the occasional crack of settling wood or a distant gust trying its luck against the walls. It's strange how loud silence can be out here. There's no hum of traffic, no distant neighbour's dog, just your own breathing and the occasional creak of a floorboard. Scholars today argue whether people in the Old West truly suffered as much as popular culture suggests, or whether we inflate their hardship through nostalgia. Some say diaries and letters prove daily life was gruelling and constant. Others suggest that folks adapted more than we give them credit for, building routines and communities that buffered them against the worst. The debate continues, but one thing is clear: no one looked forward to winter. Not really. They prepared for it, endured it, and then forgot it as fast as possible come spring. You wrap your coat tighter around you and glance out the frosty window, your breath fogging the pain. The snow is still falling, soft now, it'll pile up quick, smothering the prairie in silence. And there you are, tucked in your wooden shell, waiting it out like a hibernating animal with a pantry full of beans and a prayer for milder days. The last bite of your breakfast is still stuck to your molar. It tastes like dust and salt and history. By now you've accepted the cabin as your second skin, your snow-glazed bunker against a world that's all teeth and wind. But not every settler had the luxury of a proper wooden home. In fact, out on the treeless plains where timber was rarer than gold teeth, many people dug into the earth itself for shelter. Sod houses, or soddies, as they were affectionately, or resentfully called, were common across the prairie. And while they were ugly, smelly, and occasionally full of things that scurried in the walls, they had one thing going for them: warmth. You step into a sod house and the first thing you notice is the smell, earthy, wet, alive in a way that makes you feel like you're living inside a compost pile. The walls are literally made from bricks of soil and prairie grass stacked like oversized brownies and fused together by weight, mud, and stubbornness. No logs, no boards, just dirt and willpower. But in winter, that dirt does what a thin-walled log cabin often couldn't. It holds in heat. You walk across the packed earth floor, your boots crunching slightly where frost has snuck in around the edges. The roof overhead isn't much to look at. Usually wood slats, if they could be scavenged, covered with more sod. When the snow hits it, it just becomes part of the hill. From the outside, the whole thing looks like a weirdly lumpy mound, like someone buried a house halfway and forgot to finish the job. Inside it's dim, and always a little damp. But surprisingly, the temperature doesn't swing as wildly. Earth is a decent insulator. In the worst cold, a soddy might stay just above freezing inside, which, believe it or not, was a luxury. You wouldn't be warm exactly, but you wouldn't wake up with icicles forming in your eyebrows either. Of course, sod homes had their quirks, some charming, most frustrating. Rain or snowmelt could drip through the roof and land on your face at 3 a.m. in the form of a steady, icy plop. Sometimes the walls crumbled. Sometimes critters made their homes in them. There are actual reports of snakes living inside the sod walls, just peeking out during family dinner like they were part of the conversation. Mice were constant guests, spiders, beetles, the occasional bird. It was a petting zoo with none of the charm. But in terms of surviving winter, you'd take it. Sod homes were cheap, fast to build, and better at holding in heat than most slapdash cabins thrown together by someone who'd never handled a hammer before heading west. The trick was maintaining it, patching holes, sweeping up debris that fell from the ceiling, keeping the stove vent clear so the whole place didn't fill with smoke and turn into a dirt-flavoured gas chamber. And that stove, you always come back to the stove. In a sod house, the stove was even more central. Without the natural airflow of log walls or chinked cracks, the heat stayed in better, but the air got heavy, damp. You didn't so much breathe as sip the room. Smoke lingered longer. Moisture collected in corners. Every breath you took felt like it had been pre-owned. But when the blizzards hit, and they always did, you'd rather be in a sod house than a cabin with daylight peeking through the walls. Out on the prairie, the snow could fall sideways for days. Winds would scream across the flats with nothing to stop them. Snow would pile up over doorways, bury fences, flatten barns. People talked about whiteouts, where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, even at noon. If you were outside, you could get lost 10 feet from your own home and freeze to death trying to find the door again. You remember the trick, tying a rope from the front door to the barn, a literal lifeline, strung taut between the two so you could feed and water your animals without getting swallowed by the snow. Some settlers even tied ropes between rooms inside the house, just in case the roof collapsed and they had to find their way through a freezing pile of slush and tinned floors in the dark. During storms, you didn't just batten down the hatches, you went into hibernation. You closed every shutter, plugged the chimney as best you could, and settled in for days of darkness. You had your canned goods, your dried fruit, your little stack of wood that you were already rationing in your head. You did chores inside, if any were left. Sewing, mending, sharpening. If you had a book, you read it 3 times. If you had a Bible, you read it 4. You listened to the wind thumping the walls, the snow piling against the door, and you waited. There's one diary from a homesteader near Nebraska who described her sod home during a winter storm as feeling like a mud coffin. She wasn't trying to be poetic. She meant it literally. The walls closed in, the light faded. The sound of the wind was so loud it felt like a scream stuck in your teeth. Some people cracked under the pressure. Others just curled up in bed and waited until the wind stopped. But the soddy had one undeniable strength. It blended into the land. The cold didn't assault it the way it did with standing wooden structures. Blizzards passed over it like it wasn't there. And when they passed, and the snow melted, you'd climb out of your earthy cocoon and see the prairie still blanketed in white. But your house intact, your fire still smouldering, your family still alive. You can't ask for much more than that. Modern historians are split on how livable sod homes really were. Some insist they were miserable, barely a step up from caves. Others argue that they were ingenious, quick, efficient, and well-suited to the environment. There's probably truth in both. They weren't glamorous, but they worked. And out here, where the cold could kill you by breakfast, working was the highest praise a home could get. You look around your sod walls and listen to the wind press against them like a hungry ghost. The fire crackles faintly, casting soft shadows across the muddy bricks. It's not pretty, it's not dry, but for now, it's enough. You're sealed in a hushed little bubble, safe from the storm that wants to tear your face off. And really, what more can you ask of a house made of dirt? There's something about the way the wind hits the door tonight that feels different. Meaner, maybe. More personal. It doesn't just rattle the hinges like before, it pounds now in slow rhythmic bursts, as if some enormous hand is knocking just to see if you'll answer. And for a second you actually consider it, opening the door, letting the cold in, seeing what shape it takes. But then you hear it again, a sharp sound slicing through the howl of wind. And this time you know it's not the weather. It's a howl. Not the wind kind, the living kind. You freeze mid-step, bowl in hand, a crust of leftover beans congealing at the edges. The sound comes again, closer. A low, hungry wail that rises into something more desperate. Not a coyote, too deep. Not a wolf, not quite, but close. And suddenly the old stories don't seem so old. You set the bowl down gently and reach for the rifle leaning by the door. It's not loaded, of course, nothing ever is when you need it. Your fingers work awkwardly in your stiff gloves while fumbling for the cartridges on the shelf. Your breath hitches, not out of panic, just a deep ancient awareness that out here, when something calls in the dark, it's best to listen, and even better to stay very, very still. Wolves were a real threat in the Wild West, especially in winter. They were lean, starved, and smart. In the warmer months, they kept their distance, savaging the edges of towns, sniffing around barns for scraps. But in winter, they got bold. And when the snow got deep and the herds were thin, you became the next best thing to dinner. Some folks told stories about wolves following them for miles across frozen plains, just trailing at a distance, waiting for exhaustion to win. Others swore wolves could smell illness, that if you were sick and slow and alone, they knew. They weren't howling to warn you, they were marking the start of dinner. You lock the cabin door, not that it'll do much, and step away from the window. There's frost on the glass now, a film so thick you can't see through it. That's fine, you don't want to see through it. You've got just enough fire to light the cabin, casting flickering shadows that stretch long and slow across the walls. You imagine them growing claws, growing teeth, crouching beside the stove and waiting. But the truth is, the wolf isn't inside. Yet. You move to the corner where your boots and coat lie in a stiff pile. You won't go outside unless you have to, but you know the barn's vulnerable. The animals are bait, and out here you can't afford to lose even one. Not a goat, not a chicken, not even the mean little rooster who pecks your shin like he's owed money. Every one of them is calories. Warmth. Next spring, you hesitate, then wrap a scarf around your face until only your eyes remain. You load the rifle, you step outside, the cold smacks you immediately, furious that you've dared to challenge it. Your breath fogs the air and the wind slices it to ribbons. The snow is deep, mid-calf and crusted on top. You break through with every step, crunching your way toward the barn. The howl comes again, and now it's definitely closer. You stop, scan the dark. Nothing. Just snow and shadow and the kind of silence that feels like it's thinking. Out here, predators don't always announce themselves. Wolves are smarter than people give them credit for. They test boundaries, they watch, and when they're hungry, they don't charge in teeth first, they lurk. They wait for you to let your guard down. Step too far from the fire or forget to latch a gate. Then they come. You reach the barn, open the creaky door just enough to slip inside. The animals stir, nervous, restless. They know something's out there too. You check the perimeter. All intact. No breaks in the wall, no paw prints near the door. Good, for now. A movement outside catches your eye, just beyond the edge of the lantern light. A shape, tall, not human, not entirely wolf either. Or maybe your mind is playing tricks again. It does that in the cold, I mean, makes shadows into things, makes fear into facts. But this is the Wild West, and the line between myth and survival was always blurry. Some old-timers believed in winter ghosts, creatures that weren't quite animal, not quite spirit. Born from the snow, shaped by hunger, they came when the wind was loud and the moon low. Were they real? Probably not. But after weeks of isolation, half-starved, sleep-deprived and frozen, your brain can conjure anything. And who's to say what's real when no one's around to confirm it? You stare into the dark just a little too long, then close the barn door gently and wedge the board across it. No one's coming in tonight, at least not without a fight. Back in the cabin, the fire has died down to coals. You throw on a few more sticks, trying not to picture yellow eyes watching from the treeline. Because they might be. That's the joy of winter out here. It doesn't come alone. It brings fear, hunger, silence, and the reminder that humans were never meant to live in these places without tricks, fire, and luck. You sit down, rifle across your lap. The cabin groans again. Wind whistling through the cracks like it's laughing at your tiny fortress. And you remember this isn't just a battle against nature. It's a battle against what nature brings with it when it gets hungry, when it gets lonely. Scholars today debate the role of wildlife in frontier life. Some argue that settlers exaggerated animal threats to romanticize their own toughness. Others point to documented wolf attacks, bear maulings, and even panther sightings in remote territories. The truth, as always, lives in the tension between fear and fact. Maybe the wolves weren't always at the door, but they were close enough to make locking it worth your time. The fire catches again, a soft roar in the belly of the stove. You let yourself exhale slowly, watch the warmth spread across the floor in orange light. You're still cold, still alert. But maybe, just maybe, you'll sleep tonight, unless something scratches at the door again. The morning comes in slow grey layers. No sunrise, just a dull light leaking through the frost-glazed window panes, like someone forgot to turn the sky all the way on. You blink awake, stiff in every possible way, your blanket frozen in two corners where your breath settled and crystallized overnight. Somewhere under the covers as your toes have become strangers. You wiggle them just to confirm they still exist. The fire is out. Of course it is. You knew it would be. It always goes sometime between 1 and 4 in the morning, slipping away like a coward while you're unconscious. You sigh and roll onto your side, curling up tighter against the loss of heat. The cabin is so cold your breath fogs as you exhale, creating its own lazy cloud that drifts toward the ceiling and disappears into the shadows. You hear movement from the other side of the room, snoring maybe, or someone scratching. In a bunkhouse, you're never really alone. Even if it's just one other soul, there's always someone. And in the Wild West, where isolation could break you faster than the cold ever could, the bunkhouse was both a curse and a comfort. You sit up slowly, blankets still wrapped around your shoulders like a sad superhero cape, and take in the scene. 10 men, maybe 12, all crammed into one long wooden building, no bigger than a single-car garage. The bunks are stacked along the walls, some made of wood slats, others just piles of straw in a corner. A couple of guys are still asleep, hats over their eyes, boots still on. One is talking in his sleep. Another is shivering in the rhythm of a banjo solo. The air smells like sweat, damp wool, last night's beans, and something vaguely equine. There's no insulation. The wind still gets in through the warped boards and loose shingles. The stove in the centre of the room has long since given up trying. It's now just a cold lump of iron. Like a dead heart, no one has the will to restart. You shuffle toward it anyway, flint and kindling in hand, because it's your turn. Or maybe it's not, but the guy whose turn it is still snoring, and you'd rather not start the day with a fistfight. You open the stove, stir the heat ashes, and coax a flame from the last stubborn ember buried in its gut. It takes time, patience, your fingers don't bend properly. But after enough coaxing, the orange glow returns, weak but real. Slowly others stir. Boots thud onto the floor. Someone coughs hard enough to sound like an old engine failing to turn over. Mornings in the bunkhouse are never graceful. Everyone's cold, everyone's annoyed, and everyone's silently judging each other's body odour. You eat breakfast standing up because there's nowhere to sit that isn't occupied or frozen solid. Coffee, if you can call it that, is made in a dented tin pot over the reawakened fire. It's weak, bitter, and probably older than you, but it's warm, and that's the only thing that matters. You grip the mug tight, using it more like a hand warmer than an actual beverage. No one talks much. You're all still waking up, or trying to, and until the stove gets the room above refrigerator temperature, conversation is strictly optional. The bunkhouse was a staple of frontier life, especially for cowboys, ranch hands, and anyone working a cattle drive. These weren't permanent homes. They were shelters of necessity, and in winter they turned into sleeping tombs filled with frost, boots, and body heat. The men slept fully dressed, because undressing meant surrendering to the cold. You kept your coat on, you kept your hat on. Sometimes, if it was bad enough, you even kept your gloves on, waking up with your hands curled like claws and your joints screaming in protest. Privacy? Forget it. You shared everything: air, blankets, smells, sickness. If one guy caught a cold, within 2 days it made the rounds. Coughing, sneezing, fever dreams. Winter didn't just attack from outside, it clawed its way in, riding on every breath. There were no doctors, no medicine, just whiskey and hope. Some bunkhouses had heated stones passed around at night, warmed in the fire, wrapped in cloth and slipped into bedrolls like primitive hot water bottles. Others used cattle blankets, old thick canvas sheets originally made for draping over animals, now folded around humans like makeshift burrito skins. The smell never quite left, and you couldn't tell if that was the original cow or just you. Of course, there were pecking orders. The older hands got the best bunks, usually the ones furthest from the door and closest to the stove. New guys or drifters slept by the entrance, which meant you got the wind, the smoke, and the occasional boot to the head if someone mistook you for a saddlebag. You hear a voice behind you now, rough, low. Fire's finally talking. One of the older men stands by the stove warming his hands. He looks half frozen, his beard rimed with frost, like he's been licking snowbanks in his sleep. He doesn't smile. No one does before noon in the bunkhouse. You all survive the mornings on a delicate ecosystem of silence, caffeine, and shared misery. And maybe sarcasm. The occasional joke, something about someone snoring sounding like a dying horse, or a fart that froze in the air before it could escape. You laugh a little, but it's tired laughter. The kind that says, we made it through the night again, but barely. There's a scholarly debate about whether bunkhouses fostered real camaraderie or just mutual endurance. Some argue they were places of bonding, where cowboys swapped stories, sang songs, and looked out for each other. Others say it was every man for himself, a revolving door of frostbitten strangers too cold to care. The answer probably is both. Some nights you shared a flask and a story, other nights you stared at the wall and hoped no one coughed on you. Fringe fact. In particularly cold stretches, cowboys were known to sleep with their saddles, not out of love, but because they were oiled and slightly warmer than the floor. It also prevented theft, which wasn't unheard of even among bunkmates. Saddle theft was a hanging offence in some parts of the West, but that didn't stop desperate men from trying. You look around now, and the bunkhouse is finally stirring to life. The fire's doing its part. The men are dressing, stretching, stomping their boots. Outside, it's still snowing. A slow, steady fall that's already covered the corral. Another long day of cold fingers, frozen bridles, and slush-filled stirrups awaits. But for now, inside beer is tolerable, not warm but not cruel, and in the bunkhouse that's what passes for victory. You're outside again. This time by necessity, not bravery. The sky is grey in that stubborn, heavy way that says snow isn't just coming, it's settling in. You squint toward the horizon, which looks more like the inside of a tin bucket than any real stretch of landscape. Cold clings to you like guilt, and your breath hangs in the air long after you've stopped moving. You tug your coat tighter, though it doesn't help much anymore. Nothing does, not really. Today's job is simple in theory. Survive the next few hours without turning into a frontier-shaped icicle, but more specifically you're gathering heat. Not the metaphorical kind, but the old-school kind. That's right, hot rocks. You're about to reheat some literal stones and pretend they'll save your life tonight. You've already built a small fire outside the cabin, mostly out of scrapwood and bitter hope. Next to it sits a pile of round, heavy stones, the kind that hold heat better than they have any right to. You carefully stack them in the centre of the flame, just like you've done a dozen times before. The rocks hiss slightly as they warm, the moisture in them flashing into steam. You sit nearby, hands outstretched, pretending this is a smart plan and not just one more chapter in your ongoing bedtime negotiation with death. This was a real tactic, heating rocks in the fire, then wrapping them in cloth or tucking them under bedding to stay warm through the night. It's not exactly elegant, but it worked well enough to make it through a few extra hours without frostbite nibbling on your toes. Some folks even made stone beds, where they placed flat rocks beneath the mattress, heated each day and insulated with straw. And if you were really desperate, you'd just sleep on the stones themselves, like some kind of half-baked potato. You poke at the fire with a stick, watching the flames lick around the stones like they're old friends. After about an hour, you carefully lift one with tongs, improvised of course, and transfer it into a wool sack. You set it aside, then go for the next. You'll do this 4 or 5 times until you've got a handful of lava-hot rocks bundled and ready. Carrying them inside is a delicate operation. You learned that the hard way last winter, when one rolled out of its wrappings and seared a perfect circle into your floorboards. Now you wrap them tight, extra layers, even a scrap of oilcloth if you're feeling fancy. Inside the cabin, the fire still sputters, half-hearted and dim. You place the rocks beneath the bedroll, under blankets, at your feet, anywhere you might benefit from a little radiant warmth. They don't stay hot for long, maybe a few hours, but they might just keep you from shivering yourself awake for the 6th time tonight. You sit on the edge of the bed and rub your hands together, considering whether you've gone soft or just inventive. Probably both, but in the West, survival wasn't about honour. It was about improvisation. You made things work because there were no other options. And if that meant warming up river stones and spooning them like they owed you money, well, so be it. Still, you can't help but laugh, a little, quietly, because somewhere in your memory, there's a tale about a man who tried to use hot bricks instead of stones and set his entire blanket on fire in the middle of the night. He was fine, burned his eyebrows off, lost some dignity, but survived, and now that story is passed around every winter like a warning wrapped in humour. Don't trust a brick, son. They don't hold a grudge, but they do hold flame. Scholars have speculated about the psychological comfort of rituals like this. Heating rocks, building the fire just so, placing everything in the same position night after night. It was more than habit. It was control, a tiny sliver of power in a world where so little was predictable. The cold might be merciless, but the hot rock? That was something you could count on. Fringe fact? Some indigenous tribes, long before settlers arrived, used heated stones in sweat lodges, not just for survival, but for ceremony, purification, and community bonding. The knowledge that fire and rock could partner to create heat in harsh climates wasn't new. Settlers just borrowed it, stripped it of its ritual, and turned it into a matter of bodily survival. You lie back now, feeling the subtle warmth drift up through the blankets. It's not a bonfire, it's not central heat, but it's something. A pocket of warmth, no larger than a dinner plate, spreading slowly into your bedding like a secret. You pull the covers tighter, already knowing the heat won't last the night. But you don't need it to. You just need it to last until you fall asleep. After that, well, good luck, subconscious. The fire cracks in the stove, the wind moans against the window. Somewhere outside, snow shifts Kitta off the roof with a heavy whoomp, and for a moment, you imagine it sealing you in completely. You imagine this cabin becoming your frozen tomb, the hot rocks your last embrace. A bit dramatic, sure, but that's what winter does. It gets into your head. You think back to what your neighbour said last week, before the last storm rolled in. If your fire goes out and you've got no more wood, heat a rock and hold it close. It might not save your body, but it'll save your will. That's stuck with you. Because sometimes, when you're out here, alone, tired, trying to outwit a season that doesn't care if you live or die, your will is the only thing you've got left. The room is quiet now, the kind of silence that pushes into your ears like pressure. You shift under the covers and place one hand against the rock at your feet. Still warm, not hot anymore, but better than nothing. Like a loyal friend, fading fast, but still trying to hold on. You drift slowly into sleep, your body wrapped in wool, your breath rising in little puffs, your mind chasing the last of the warmth before it goes. And when it does, you'll get up and do it all again tomorrow. You wake up to a noise you never want to hear in winter. A sharp, breathless snort, followed by a crack and a heavy thud. You sit bolt upright, heart pounding, eyes darting toward the window where light is just beginning to sneak through the frost. The cold rushes in around your neck like it's been waiting all night for this exact moment to pounce. You grab your boots, still stiff, still damp, and shove your feet in without thinking. Something is wrong. Outside, the world is covered in a fresh quilt of snow. The wind has finally calmed, leaving a white seminoe so thick you could slice it. And there, by the barn, is your horse. Or rather, what's left of your horse's dignity. He's on his side in the snow, snorting and scrambling, legs flailing awkwardly. The poor beast has slipped on ice and gone down hard. You're moving before your brain fully catches up, coat half buttoned, gloves missing, rifle left behind. You wade through the snow, boots crunching, heart thudding. The closer you get, the more you see. Wide eyes, heaving flanks. A dark patch on the snow where his body melted through to the frozen ground. He's panicking now. Not hurt bad yet. But if he keeps thrashing, that could change real fast. You drop to your knees beside him, grabbing the halter, murmuring nonsense words. Anything to get him to stop fighting you. That's the thing people forget when they talk about the Wild West. Your horse wasn't just transportation. It was your radiator, your lifeline, your only heat source with 4 legs and opinions. In winter, horses didn't sleep in barns unless you had money or forethought. Most of the time, they were outside, covered in frost, looking miserable and majestic all at once. You shared your warmth with them, and in return they shared theirs. Sometimes, in the worst stretches of cold, you'd sleep beside your horse, literally. You'd nestle in close, saddle for a pillow, blanket thrown over the both of you, hoping their body heat would keep your lungs from freezing shut overnight. A healthy horse runs hot, and if you were lucky enough to have one who'd tolerate your shivering form pressed against its side, you treated them like royalty. You managed to get your horse back on his feet, shaky, annoyed, but upright. His breath fogs the air in thick white bursts. You run your hands down his legs, feeling for heat, swelling, stiffness. He seems okay, shaken, but okay. You lead him slowly back to the barn, rubbing his flank as you go. Inside, the air is just a few degrees warmer, but it might as well be a sauna compared to outside. You toss him an extra flake of hay and cover his back with a wool saddle blanket. He munches quietly, tail flicking. Crisis, for now, averted. You lean against the stall door and exhale hard. Your breath hits the air like steam and your knees ache from kneeling in the snow. And here's the real kicker. This won't be the last time, not even close, because in the Wild West, horses went down all the time. On ice, in snowdrifts, spooked by shadows, startled by wind. And each time it was a gamble. If they broke a leg, you couldn't call a vet. You either put them down yourself or left them to the elements. That's why horse blankets were treated like sacred artifacts in the winter. A thick wool or buffalo hide blanket thrown over your mount could mean the difference between a working animal and a frozen statue. Some settlers even made their own, sewing together patchwork layers of felt and scrap cloth, dousing them with the animal fat to keep them water resistant. Not pretty, but effective. And if you lost your horse, you walked, if you could, which in the deep snow and freezing cold was often just a slower death. There's a story you remember, a fringe bit of folklore from a Wyoming cattleman, about a man who let his horse into the cabin during a whiteout. Not the barn, the cabin. He cleared the table, shoved the bed against the wall, and opened the door. The horse stood in the middle of the room for 2 days while the storm raged, steam rising off its back as it dozed like a radiator with hooves. The cabin stayed warm, the horse didn't wreck the place, and when the storm passed, both walked out alive. The neighbours called him insane. But none of them had frozen to death in a blizzard with a frozen horse corpse blocking the door either. You head back inside now, fingers numb again despite your best efforts. The fire has shrunk, but it's still holding on. You toss on another log and strip off your wet gloves, laying them near the heat to dry. Your pants are soaked at the knees. You can already feel the ice forming where the snow melted and wickered up the wool. You change into the driest pair of socks you have left and sit, hands outstretched, watching the steam rise from your clothes. The cabin is quiet, save for the ticking of the stove and the occasional creak of a roof beam. And it hits you, again, how much of surviving the cold out here wasn't about battling nature. It was about managing every small failure. A slipped horse, a frozen glove, a damp sock. Every single thing could be the first domino in a line that ended with you face down in a snowbank wondering what tiny mistake did you in. Historians still debate just how common it was for settlers to rely on their horses for heat. Some claim it was romanticised frontier myth. Others insist it was standard practice in the colder territories. The reality, it depends on how cold it got and how desperate you were. Which, let's be honest, was very unoften. You pull your blanket tighter, stretching your legs toward the fire. Your toes are thawing slowly, painfully. They tingle in that special demonic way that suggests Frostbite was invited to the party and then got kicked out at the last minute. You flex them anyway, just to remind them who's boss. Outside, your horse stomps once, then settles. You smile, not because anything's easier now, but because you both made it through another close call. You'll check on him again tonight. Maybe bring him something extra. Maybe lean against him if it gets bad. Not because you're sentimental, but because he's warmer than your bed. You always knew cowboys looked good in movies, all that leather and grit and cool, windblown silence. But nobody told you how much of that image falls apart the moment snow enters the picture. The so-called winter cowboy is mostly a myth, and if you're living through this mess, you already understand why. Snow doesn't make you look cool. It makes your fingers useless and your saddle slippery. It freezes your stirrups, turns your reins into ropes of ice and turns you into something that vaguely resembles a damp scarecrow with chattering teeth. Most cowboys didn't even work in winter. It's a weird truth that gets glossed over in all the Wild West reenactments and dime novels. Cowboying was a seasonal job, mostly from spring through early fall, branding, herding, driving cattle across distances that felt like entire continents. When winter arrived, the work dried up, so did the fun. Most cowboys drifted into bunkhouses, saloons, or anywhere with a roof and the promise of dry socks. Some stayed on as ranch hands through the cold months, tending to the cattle that didn't make the drive, but that was often the exception, not the rule. You shift in your saddle now, trying to feel something in your legs. Anything, really. Even pain would be a relief. The cold has crept under your coat and made a nest beneath your ribs. Snow is falling again. Fine, powdery stuff that looks pretty, until you realise it means there's another 3 hours of trudging through sludge before you get back to the line shack. Your horse, bless him, is as miserable as you are. Ears pinned, tail twitching, every step slower than the last. You're not driving a herd today, just checking fence lines. Making sure none of the cows have wandered off or broken through. That's another fun part of winter ranching. Cows lose their minds in snow. They wander into gullies and can't get back out. They fall into drifts and can't stand up again. Sometimes they just stand in the middle of nowhere and moo like it's someone else's problem. and guess who gets to go find them? You pull your collar up and lean forward as the wind picks up again. It slices through your coat like it's made of tissue paper. That's the thing about cowboy gear. It looks good, but it wasn't exactly made for Arctic survival. Wool helped, so did layering. But at some point, cold just got the better of you. Mittens turned stiff, spurs froze onto boots, saddles got so hard with frost you felt like you were riding a block of granite. Even the saddle horn could give you frostbite if you gripped it with bare hands. And speaking of saddles, let's talk about mounting a horse when everything, including your knees, is frozen. It's like climbing onto a bar stool made of ice while wearing 5 layers and a pair of boots filled with regret. You heave yourself up, leg barely clearing the stirrup, and land in the saddle with the grace of a falling barrel. The horse skis like he's used to it. You mutter something at him. He mutters something back, probably about your riding skills. You stop at a fence post, dismount, and chipper away the ice crusted around the wire. One strand is broken. Probably a deer, or the wind, or maybe the cows got bold again. You pull off a glove with your teeth and reach for the pliers. The metal bites instantly into your skin like it's made of punishment. You curse, drop the pliers, pick them up, then fix the wire anyway, because what else can you do? Your hands are shaking now, not from cold exactly, but from that deep bone-level fatigue that settles in after hours outside. You climb back on the horse, slower this time, and keep riding. There's another half-mile to check. You try not to think about it. You just focus on moving forward. Every cowboy had their own cold ritual. Some sang, some talked to their horses, others just rode in silence, teeth clenched, repeating the same thoughts over and over like a broken prayer. Just get to the next fence. Just get to the shack. Just get to spring. You never thought cowboying would turn you into a monk, but here you are, cold enough to see your soul in the frost on your moustache. There's a fringe belief you once heard from an old hand. He swore by it like it was gospel. He said you should rub snow on your cheeks every few minutes to keep frostbite from settling in. His theory was that shocking the skin with more cold kept the blood moving. No science behind it, just a desperate man trying to outrun the freeze with worse ideas. He lost half an ear by the end of that winter, so maybe don't follow that one too closely. You finally reach the line shack by late afternoon. It's a squat, miserable structure, more of a wooden apology than a real shelter. But it has a door, it has a stove, and inside it's only slightly below freezing, which counts as tropical by today's standards. You unsaddle your horse, brush the snow off his back, and lead him into the lean-to beside the shack. He snorts at you like he expects hot oats and a wool blanket. You give him a pat and promise you'll warm up some water for him. Inside, you light a fire with frozen fingers and even colder matches. It takes longer than it should. Eventually, the stove comes to life, coughing smoke and grumbling into heat. You strip off your outer layer and sit on a wooden crate, steam rising from your back like you're cooking from the inside out. And as you sit there, warming up piece by piece, you realise the cowboy mythos left out all the best parts. The smell of wet wool, the sting of thawing hands, the way your boots squelch with melted snow, the feeling of your fingers slowly coming back to life like reanimated corpses. This is the real cowboy winter. Quiet, uncomfortable, and absolutely not romantic. Historians occasionally debate how widespread cowboy work was in winter. Some records show herds being managed year-round. Others suggest most operations shut down completely once the snow hit. It likely depended on geography. Texas cowboys had it easier than Montana hands. But wherever you were, winter changed the game. The hat stayed, sure, but underneath it was a frozen man with chapped lips and a long list of regrets. You open a tin of beans, set it near the stove and stare into the fire. Outside, the wind has picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the shack like it's laughing at you. You're tired, you're sore, but you're inside. You made it through another day. You shift your weight, wincing as your back reminds you how long you've been riding. Maybe tomorrow you'll find that missing steer. Maybe tomorrow the snow will ease up. Maybe not. But either way, you'll saddle up. Because even if the winter cowboy is a myth, you're still out here. The wind's finally died down tonight, which should be good news, but instead it just makes the silence feel suspicious. You sit by the stove, staring into the little blue flickers at the edge of the fire, listening for anything. Hoofbeats, voices, even that high-pitched whine the wind makes when it crawls through gaps in the wall. But there's nothing. Just your heartbeat and the occasional pop from the firewood, like the cabin itself is trying to keep you company. You stretch your legs, careful not to knock over the tin cup perched on the floor near your boot. It's filled with something that's warm, strong, and has been described politely as firewater. You take a sip and immediately regret everything. Whiskey in the Wild West wasn't smooth. It was gut-punching, eye-watering, questionable at best swill made from whatever someone could ferment, distill, and convince other people to drink. Frontier whiskey had names like Prairie Lightning or Red Eye, and more than a few bottles included ingredients that were illegal, flammable, or just plain toxic. Turpentine, kerosene, chewing tobacco juice. Why not? If it burned on the way down and made you forget your cold toes for a few hours, it was good enough. You shift again and stare across the cabin toward the bag hanging by the door. Inside it are the last few items you bartered for at the trading post 3 weeks ago. Dried apples, a square of hard cheese that's gone suspiciously glossy, a bundle of matches, and half a bottle of the whiskey now, currently trying to melt a hole through your stomach lining. You'd gone in with a half-frozen rabbit and a pair of threadbare gloves, and walked out with what amounted to survival in a sack. The trading post wasn't a place you went for fun. It was a negotiation hall disguised as a store. Run by someone who always had too few teeth and too much nerve, it stocked everything from ammunition to axle grease to pipe tobacco carved from the bark of unknown trees. The prices were criminal, the barter rates were worse, but in winter it was one of the few places where you could still find fire, conversation, and that strange frontier comfort of watching someone else freeze for once. You'd ridden there in snow up to your shins, wrapped in everything you owned. The horses were tied out front, half buried in drifts and glaring at nothing. Inside, the place smelled like pipe smoke, wet leather, and pickled onions. The pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated uneven heat, turning the first 3 feet of the store into a sweaty oasis, and leaving the rest frozen stiff. The man behind the counter, greasy hat, yellow teeth, good aim, gave you a once-over like he was appraising not just your trade goods, but your odds of making it to spring. Still, you found what you needed, and after a bit of bluffing, swearing, and shameless begging, he tossed in the whiskey. "It'll keep you warm," he said, "or make you think you're warm until you freeze to death. Either way, you won't feel much." Back in the cabin, you set the tin cup down and exhale slowly. He wasn't wrong. Your fingers still sting, your shoulders still ache. But your insides feel about 5 degrees warmer than they did 10 minutes ago. Or maybe it's just the buzz. Either way, you're not complaining. And hey, it's not like there's a saloon down the road or a tavern with a roaring fire and a piano player taking requests. Out here, you drink alone, with the wind for company. Not that saloons were any better in winter. The classic image of the bustling bar full of cowboys clinking glasses and yelling over ragtime music falls apart fast when it's 20 below and the stove can't keep up. Even inside, men kept their coats on. The bartender wore gloves. The piano keys were so cold they'd crack if played too hard. And if the bar had a back room for cards or dice, the stakes usually included body heat and questionable blankets. Some boomtowns had the luxury of coal, but most saloons burned wood and lots of it. You could go through an entire cord in a day just trying to keep the place from icing over. That meant constant chopping, hauling and shoveling, even if you were the one paying for drinks. Want another glass of corn whiskey? Great, grab an axe and prove it. Want a chair by the stove? Better hope you got there early, or were willing to share it with a man who smelled like he hadn't seen soap since the Grant administration. It wasn't all bleak. Even in the cold, people found ways to laugh. You remember one old guy at a trading post who swore he never felt the cold because he kept a warm stone in his boot and a hotter one in his belly. He meant whiskey, obviously. He was red-faced, half-blind, and somehow still standing. You never found out if he was joking. You kind of hope he wasn't. There's some scholarly debate over just how important alcohol was to winter survival on the frontier. Some claim it was a necessity, a medicinal morale-boosting part of everyday life. Others argue it caused more harm than help, leading to accidents, hypothermia, and the kind of poor judgment that gets you stuck outside with your pants frozen to a log. Both sides are probably right. But one thing is certain, a shot of whiskey at the right moment could feel like a miracle, even if it was just a placebo with a burn. You toss another log into the stove, watching the sparks drift up like fireflies before vanishing. The warmth returns slowly, not enough to make the room comfortable, but enough to make it not unlivable. You wrap your blanket tighter, pull your hat down, and take one last sip from the cup. The whiskey's not good. It might not even be whiskey, but it's what you've got. And out here, when the snow starts piling against the door and the wind forgets how to stop, sometimes all you can ask for is a little heat in your belly and a roof that hasn't caved in yet. You're woken in the middle of the night by the sound of screaming, not the panicked kind, not terror, but sharp rhythmic cries cutting through the cabin walls like a saw through green wood. You sit up fast, heart pounding, lungs already drawing in air like they're prepping for a sprint. The fire's burned low again, throwing long shadows across the floor, and everything in your body says don't move, just listen. Then you hear it again, familiar, awful, and this time you realise what it is. Someone's in labour. You throw off the covers and reach for your boots. No one plans to give birth during a snowstorm, not in a one-room cabin with ice forming along the inside of the walls. But babies don't check the calendar. Out here in the rough-boned edge of nowhere, they show up when they feel like it. And sometimes you just pray they come out screaming because silence can be so much worse. You pull your coat on over your nightclothes and step outside, crunching through knee-deep snow toward the cabin next door. You were told weeks ago it could happen any day. Sarah, 22, already lost 2 babies before this one. No doctor within 50 miles. No midwife except the neighbour lady with 3 grown kids and a pair of iron nerves. And tonight, she's doing it all by firelight, boiled rags and second-hand prayers. Inside, the air is thick. Sweat, smoke, panic. The woman in charge barks instructions like a trail boss, but gently, calmly. More water. Get the towels near the heat. Hold her hand. No, tighter. Sarah is curled in a pile of quilts on the floor, because the bed was too cold and too high and somehow just wrong. Her face is flushed, jaw locked, fingers clenched around a bundle of fabric like it's holding her together. You kneel beside her, unsure of what to say, so you say nothing. This is what winter survival really looked like. Birth with a side of frostbite. No clean hospitals, no sterile gloves. Just hands scrubbed with lye soap and prayers whispered between contractions. The fire's been burning steady for hours, but it still isn't warm enough. The wind keeps sneaking in through the eaves. The boiling pot of water rattles gently on the stove, a small percussion to the gasps and groans and shouts that fill the room like thunder. Someone tries to close a window tighter, stuffing a rag into the crack, but it's no good. The baby's not going to wait for better insulation. You sit beside Sarah and let her squeeze your hand until your knuckles feel like splinters. Her breath comes fast, then faster, then slower, then gone. You think she's passed out. You panic. Then she opens her eyes again and shouts so loud it nearly knocks your hat off. It's a long hour. Or maybe 3. Time stretches and contracts like the woman herself. Then suddenly a rush of noise, movement, towels and silence. That kind of thick, heavy silence that feels like the world holding its breath. And then, thank God, a cry. Tiny, wet, beautifully angry. The midwife lifts the baby up like she's raising a secret, wrapped in a towel, and you feel every muscle in your body unclench. Sarah sobs, not from pain now, but from something bigger. Relief, fear, joy, exhaustion, all of it. You help clean up, not because you're asked, but because there's no one else to do it. Towels are rinsed and hung near the fire. The floor is wiped down. The basin of bloody water is emptied out the back door into snow so clean it almost feels like an insult. The wind howls again, but you don't care. There's warmth in this room now. Not just fire, not just bodies, but something else, something stronger. Once things settle, the midwife finally collapses onto a stool and mutters something about whiskey. You find a bottle behind the stove and pour her a shot, then one for yourself. It's the same firewater as before, burns like betrayal, but it feels like ceremony now. You raise the tin cup in silence. She nods once. No toast. Just 2 people who saw something raw and real and impossibly ordinary. You stay until morning. No one asks you to, but you do. The baby, a girl, they decide, sleeps in a basket near the fire, swaddled in every scrap of warmth they could find. You watch her tiny chest rise and fall and wonder how something so small can survive something so big. The odds were against her, against Sarah, against everyone. But they're here. That's enough. Historians like to talk about homesteading with broad strokes. Acres ploughed, cabins built, cattle driven across wild land. But the reality lived in nights like this. Childbirth in the snow, under low beams and high stakes, with pain echoing as sobbing off the walls and hope tied up in a bundle of wet cloth. They don't always talk about the ones who didn't make it. The babies stillborn in the dead of winter. The mothers who bled out with no one there to help. The infants buried in frozen soil because the ground couldn't be dug for weeks and they had to be stored. Stored until it thawed. The records skip over those parts. Too sad, too common, too human. But tonight, there's a survivor, and that counts for something. You step outside as the sun finally breaks over the snowy ridge, lighting up the whole world in golden ice. The wind's gone, replaced by a stillness that feels holy. You pull your coat tighter and head back toward your own cabin, every footstep softer than usual, not from cold but from reverence, from awe. You know it's not over. The baby still has to survive her first month. The cabin could still collapse. The stove could go out, but for now they're breathing. They're alive, and out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of winter, that's the biggest miracle you're ever going to get. You don't usually get visitors in the dead of winter, especially not before dawn, especially not moving silently through thigh-deep snow like a shadow in buckskins. But this morning there's a knock at the door, soft, deliberate, and strange enough to snap you out of your half-sleep instantly. You swing your legs over the side of the bed, blinking into the frozen air, heart already shifting into that half-alert rhythm it always slips into when something feels off. You weren't expecting anyone. Not today. Not this season. You crack the door open and there he stands, tall, wrapped in layers of fur and leather, steam rising from his shoulders like mist off a river. He nods once, doesn't speak. You open the door wider. He steps inside without ceremony, brushing the snow from his shoulders in one slow sweep. He's from the Lakota settlement downriver, one of the last still living in the old way, moving with the seasons, building only what's needed, surviving not in spite of the land but with it. You've traded before, salt pork for smoked meat, flour for furs, but never spoken much beyond what was necessary, not for lack of respect, just an understanding that words aren't always the best tool in the box. He sets down a bundle wrapped in hide, furs you assume, and moves toward the fire like he's done it 100 times. You gesture toward the kettle, and he nods. You pour 2 tin cups of bitter coffee and hand one over. He drinks it straight, no sugar, no grimace. The two of you sit in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need filling. Just the fire, the faint whistle of wind beyond the walls, and the knowledge that he didn't walk 4 miles through snow just to exchange pleasantries. Eventually he speaks, soft, direct. One of their women is sick, bad sick. Can't keep warm, fevered. He says they've run out of dried herbs and need more willow bark. You nod and gesture toward the corner where your supplies are. You've got a little, not much, but some. Enough, maybe. You wrap it up for him and hand it over without asking questions. You don't need to, because when it comes to surviving winter, the indigenous people of the West had already written the manual generations before anyone from back east showed up and started acting like they had discovered something. Long before cabins, sod houses, or even buffalo robes over wooden floors, they knew how to beat the cold, how to dress, how to move, how to build, how to endure, and not with fireplaces and flannel, but with thousands of years of passed-down knowledge. Portable tippies with insulated hides, snowshoes that skimmed across drifts like feathers, carefully smoked meat that kept for months without a single mason jar in sight. You think of how ridiculous settlers must have looked at first, shivering in wet wool and clunky boots while native families moved gracefully through blizzards in footwear made of moose hide and ingenuity. They layered fur and leather with air pockets in between, not for fashion, but because air traps heat. Something modern folks still haven't fully figured out with their puffed-up parkas and shiny ski gear. Even the shelters were smarter. Tippies weren't just tents. They were engineering marvels designed to ventilate smoke, shed snow, and be broken down and rebuilt faster than you can find kindling in a pine forest. In a storm, they didn't fight the wind. They ducked under it. Settlers kept trying to build houses that resisted nature. Native people built ones that moved with it. Your visitor finishes his coffee and stands. You don't ask for anything in return, wouldn't dream of it. But he leaves a pelt on the table anyway. A gift. Not required, but offered. Mutual respect. You nod again. He nods back. Then he's gone, swallowed up by the snow like he was never there to begin with. You step outside, watching his footprints disappear into the white. They vanish fast. Snow has a way of erasing things. Names. Borders. Even whole histories if you're not paying attention. And when it comes to history, the winter survival methods of Native Americans are criminally underrepresented. People like to imagine they were primitive, that they just hunkered down and got lucky. But they were deliberate, efficient, adapted in ways settlers never were. They tracked animal migrations, harvested bark and roots with medicinal properties, stored fat from fall kills to eat slowly through the season. They used pemmican, a mix of dried meat, berries and fat that could last months without spoilage and kept you alive even when the snow was too deep to hunt. There's a story you once heard about a northern tribe using snow as insulation, not just as something to dig out from, but to build into. They'd pack snow into hollow walls around their lodges, creating natural windbreaks. One man said his winter lodge, half dug into a hillside and half covered in snow, was warmer than any clapboard house he'd ever slept in. No stove, just coals and centuries of knowing exactly what they were doing. The scholarly debate is quieter on this subject, but growing. More researchers now acknowledge that settlers learned a great deal about cold weather survival from indigenous groups, even if they rarely gave credit. Snowshoe design, fur layering, even shelter positioning, all borrowed. But in the books, it's usually framed as the pioneer figured it out, as if that happened in a vacuum. It didn't. It happened because someone showed them and the settler was smart enough or cold enough to listen. You return to your fire, toss in another log, and think about how often help comes quietly. No trumpets, no announcements. Just a knock on the door and a man with snow on his shoulders who knows what you don't. There's still so much to learn. You pour yourself another cup of that miserable coffee and sit by the stove. Outside, the storm is returning. You can see it building in the clouds, slow and thick, dragging a curtain across the horizon. But you feel a little steadier now, not because the cold is any less cruel, but because you are just reminded that survival out here isn't a solo act. It's a passing of knowledge, a shared nod in the dark, a quiet agreement between two people who've both had to make peace with a landscape that doesn't care if they wake up tomorrow. You stare into the fire and let that warmth sit in your bones a while. The sky has turned that particular shade of steel grey that makes your stomach knot before the snow even falls. You know what's coming. The air feels thick, heavy, like it's waiting to drop. You double-check the cabinet door, tie the shutters closed with strips of rawhide and either stack of firewood inside. It's decent. Not good, not, we'll ride this out in comfort good, but it'll do if the storm moves fast. You take a breath and glance out the side window. The horizon's already disappearing in a swirl of white. Blizzard's coming. Now here's the part they don't tell you in storybooks. Snowstorms in the Wild West weren't just inconvenient, they were existential threats with bad timing. And if you were on the move when one hit, God help you. Especially if you were part of a wagon train. You imagine it now, a line of covered wagons inching their way through the middle of nowhere. Wheels half buried in snow, oxen steaming, men with faces chapped raw, and women hunched over children bundled in every scrap of wool they own. It's not heroic, it's not romantic, it's stupidly dangerous, and it happened more often than anyone cared to admit. You remember reading about one train in particular caught on the open prairie in an early October whiteout. Snow came fast, angry, visibility dropped to nothing in under an hour. They tried to press on, but after a few wagons slipped into ditches and one man wandered off and never came back, they called it. They circled the wagons not to defend against enemies, but to shield against wind that felt like it was made of knives. The canvas tops were barely protection at all. Wind tore right through them, snow gathered on the ribs, and by morning the inside of the wagons looked like walk-in freezers. You shift in your chair now, fingers brushing the windowsill, and imagine being under one of those wagons as the storm bore down. That was a trick some of them used. Crawl underneath. The snow would pile over the top and actually insulate you underneath, like a cruel little snow tub. You'd lie there in the dark, sandwiched between the earth and the freezing void, praying the oxen didn't step sideways and crush you. Kids, elders, and anyone too sick to fight the wind would huddle together under those wooden frames, listening to the storm scream around them, feeling snow seep through every gap. Fringe fact? Some wagons were intentionally banked with snow after stopping, piling drifts around the base to seal out wind. It worked, sort of. You still woke up with frost on your eyelashes and your toes curled into claws, but it kept the worst of the storm at bay. If your oxen didn't wander off or freeze in place, and if no one got lost going to relieve themselves behind a bush, you stood a fair chance of surviving the night. But that was the cruelest part of blizzards on the move, the whiteout. You didn't just get cold, you got lost. The wind erased everything, roads, trails, landmarks, even your own footprints. Turn around once and you might never find your way back. Entire parties were known to vanish a few yards from their camp. People tied ropes between wagons and trees or between their wrist and the axle, just to be sure they could return after stepping out to pee, and if the rope snapped, or if the wind dragged you too far, that was it. You became a ghost story whispered at the next campfire. You sip the last of your weak coffee and stare into the corner of the room where your bedroll waits. It looks inviting if slightly damp. You'd set it near the stove for warmth, but now the storm is making the walls moan, and you're already wondering if you'll need to sleep in your coat again. Or maybe under the table, not because it's warmer, just because it's further from the door. You don't want to think about snow finding its way through the frame, but it always does. Like smoke in reverse, cold seeps in, thick and sneaky. Out on the trail, families had it worse. You think of the children wrapped in quilts made from old shirts and wagon covers, faces buried into their mother's chest while the wind clawed at the sides of the wagon like it wanted in. Some of them were already sick from the journey. The cold didn't need much help. A cough, a fever, a night spent shivering on wet canvas, and that was that. Some wagons carried coffins already built and packed, just in case. Some didn't even bother with the box. Historians today debate how many wagon trains were actually lost to winter storms. The records are thin. Most survivors didn't write down every detail, and the ones who didn't survive didn't write anything at all. But what we do know is this. Snowstorms were respected, feared. The minute someone said bad weather's rolling in, every soul on the trail looked up, packed fast and prayed harder. You light a lantern now just in case the fire goes out during the night. The shadows on the wall dance like they're nervous. You roll your spare blanket tight and tuck it near your boots. No reason, just instinct. And you check the rifle again, though you're not expecting visitors. Not human ones, anyway. Storms do strange things to the world. Make you hear sounds that aren't there. Footsteps in the snow, whispers in the wind. A knock on the door when no one's knocking. There's a diary entry from an unknown traveller, 1883, somewhere in Kansas. All it says is, "Blizzard came fast, wagons turned, we hunkered low, Mary wept quietly, snow came through the seams. We heard a baby cry, but there was no baby in our wagon." It could be nonsense, exhaustion, delirium, or something else. Doesn't matter. The point is, blizzards don't just test your body, they test your mind. The cold doesn't always kill you outright. Sometimes it just whittles you down until you forget how to survive. Outside, the wind started again. Not full yet, but gaining. You can hear the way it builds in waves. Soft, then sharp, then gone. Like it's breathing. You stack another log on the fire. And this time, you don't sit back down. You just stand there for a while listening, counting the seconds between gusts. You're not going anywhere tonight. And you're grateful, truly, that you've got 4 walls and a roof instead of a wagon and a white sky. But part of you still flinches at every creak. Because winter doesn't need to knock. It already knows where you live. The wind has a sound tonight you haven't heard before. Not just howling, not just whistling, but a kind of distant thrum, like a heartbeat in the snow. You sit up in your bedroll and tilt your head toward the noise. It's faint, rhythmically uneven, and far too steady to be an animal. Then it clicks. It's not the wind, it's footsteps. But not boots, not hooves, something lighter, softer, deliberate. You pull on your coat and ease to the door, opening it just enough to peek outside. The storm hasn't hit full strength yet, but flakes fall sideways and the horizon's been erased. You squint into the white, then you see him, a man on snowshoes, moving slowly across the drifted path, like a ghost pulled forward by duty alone. He's bundled up tight, face wrapped in a scarf, shoulders hunched under a mailbag that's nearly the size of his torso. You open the door wider and wave him in. He hesitates just long enough to remind you that trust is earned in this world, then steps inside, carrying the cold on his back like an unwelcome guest. He shrugs off his outer layers slowly, deliberately, revealing a weather-beaten face and hands that shake from exhaustion. You've heard of men like him, winter mail carriers, the quiet backbone of communication across the vast frozen West. Not soldiers, not frontiersmen, just stubborn souls who refuse to let a little snow, or 100 miles of it, stand between a letter and its destination. He hands you the satchel. You take it without a word, place it near the fire, and pour him a cup of something hot. Coffee, maybe, or at least what passes for it after you've reused the grounds twice, and added a pinch of pine bark for flavour. He drinks it like it's the best thing he's ever tasted. You ask how far he's come. He says from Sweetwater, like that's just down the road, when in reality it's at least 30 miles of uphill sow and wind. Then he says, almost casually, that the bridge is out past the ridge, and he had to go around through the gulch, which added another 6 miles. Then he says he lost a glove. Then he says nothing at all. Just sips and blinks at the fire like he's watching memories dance in the flame. These were the men who kept the West stitched together in winter. Mail runners, snowshoe couriers, riders who took to frozen trails when no one else would. The railroads didn't always run, the roads were impassable, but people still waited for news, for letters, for packages, and somewhere out in that bitter silence, a figure moved steadily through the white, delivering hope in an oilskin stuck in sack. You pull the mailbag closer and sort through it slowly. It's not much. 2 letters, both damp but legible, and a small bundle wrapped in twine, probably medicine, or dried fruit, or a lock of someone's hair sent with more care than you'll ever understand. There's nothing for you this time, but you sort the mail anyway. Out of habit, out of respect. You look at the man again, his face is flushed, his lips cracked. You ask where he's headed next. He taps his fingers twice on the rim of the tin cup. East Fork, he says. Couple families out that way, expecting news. You do the math in your head. That's another 12 miles, maybe more, through rising wind, through drifts that could swallow a wagon. You say nothing, but your face says plenty. He shrugs. They're waiting, he says, as if that explains everything. And maybe it does. There's an open debate among historians about how essential these mail couriers truly were. Some claim most messages could wait. Others argue they were the only thread holding together families, friendships, and trade networks through the months when everything else froze. But if you ever meet one of these men, and tonight you have, you don't need a historian's opinion. You just watch him rub warmth back into his hands and then lace up his boots again without complaint, and you understand. These weren't trained athletes or paid professionals with backup and warm hotels. Most were hired local, trusted because they knew the land better than maps did. They used snowshoes carved by hand and wore layers made of deer hide, rabbit fur and prayer. They slept under trees, ate jerky until their jaws ached, carried revolvers not for show but for wolves or worse, and sometimes they delivered letters that arrived weeks after the sender had already died. There's a fringe story out of Montana, maybe a tall tale, maybe not, about a mail carrier who made a 50-mile trek through a snowstorm with a broken leg and a dislocated shoulder. They say he strapped the arm to his chest, splinted the leg with pine, and still made it to the next outpost. When asked why he didn't wait for rescue, he supposedly said, "Didn't want to disappoint the widow." You offer the man your cot, but he waves you off. Says he'll leave before first light, wants to get across the pass before it gets worse. You refill his cup anyway, toss a couple extra logs on the fire, and hang his coat near the stove. He'll rest for a few hours, then vanish again. One pair of tracks eating away into the white, and someone miles from here will get a letter they thought lost. A little news from home, a reminder that they still exist. You sit back down, watching the flames lick up the sides of the stove. Your visitor has already leaned back in his chair, arms folded, eyes closed. Not asleep, just still. You can tell he sleeps light. Probably hasn't slept deep in years. Out the window the wind returns, tapping gently on the glass like a warning. You know what's coming, he knows it too, but it won't stop him. In the morning he'll slip his pack over one shoulder, fasten his scarf and disappear into the storm like a rumour. And you'll sit here, warm by the fire, grateful someone like him exists in a world like this. Because out here, when everything else freezes or fades, someone has to carry the words. The next morning is so quiet it feels wrong. You wake expecting wind, frost flaking off the windows, maybe a gentle groan from the stove cooling in its sleep, but instead you get silence, thick as wet wool, pressing against the cabin like the world's holding its breath. You blink a few times, stretch under the mound of blankets and hides and sit up slowly. Your knees crack, your back complains. Par for the course, you swing your legs out of bed and immediately regret it. The floor is ice, not chilly, not unpleasant. Ice. Somewhere in the night, the last coals of your fire gave up the ghost, and now the whole cabin feels like the inside of a forgotten cave. You pull your boots on, fingers fumbling with the laces, and let out a breath that clouds in front of your face like pipe smoke. Outside, the snow is higher than it was yesterday, and flatter. You open the door and find a pristine white sheet stretched across the land, like someone laid out a shroud for the prairie. No footprints, no trees, just rolling waves of snow-drifted silence. It's beautiful in that smug way only nature can be. Look what I made while you were asleep. The mail carrier is already gone. Of course he is. He left no note, no sound. Just a missing pair of footprints at the door, and a faint indentation where his boots packed down the snow. He moved like smoke. That's how you survive out here. You come and go without bothering the cold too much. With the storm quiet, you decide it's time to check on the trapper's shack up the ridge. It's not close, but it's not far either. Maybe 2 miles as the crow flies, though you're not a crow, and the snow's thick enough to drown a short horse. Still you pack light, a flask, a knife, an old revolver you haven't cleaned in weeks, and the last of your good jerky. You strap on your snowshoes. They're makeshift, bent wood and rawhide, but they'll do. And then you start walking. Every step is work. The snow isn't just deep, it's deceptive. It looks soft, light and fluffy until you step in and your leg disappears. The snowshoes help spreading your weight across the surface, but they creak and slide. And the wind's picking up again. Not fast, just enough to remind you it's still here. You tug your scarf up higher and push forward. The trapper's shack comes into view just before noon. It's a squat, lopsided thing leaning slightly to the left like it's trying to duck out of the wind. The door is shut. No smoke from the chimney. You knock once. No answer. Then you knock again, louder this time. Still nothing. Your gut tightens. You push the door open. Inside it smells like old meat and pine smoke. Not fresh, just leftover. The place is small, 4 paces across, maybe 5 deep, with a single bed shoved into the corner and a stove built from scrap iron rusting at the seams. There's a pile of furs hanging from the ceiling beam, drying stiff in the cold. The trapper's not here. You look around, nothing's ransacked, no signs of a struggle, but no recent fire either. That means he's been gone at least a day, maybe 2. You check the back door. It's latched from the inside, which means he left through the front and hasn't come back. You sigh and sit for a moment on a 3-legged stool, trying to decide whether to wait or backtrack. Then you see the note, pinned under a tin cup on the little table. Gone up the ridge, got a line on something big back by a supper. But the ink's blurred, and the handwriting's shaky. Could have been written 2 days ago, maybe more. You know where he's gone. There's a ridge trail above the shack winding through the pines toward a frozen creek where the elk sometimes come down. And he's probably out there still, stuck in a drift, lost in the snow or worse. You think about going after him, then you think about dying in a snowstorm for someone who might already be dead. Then you stand up anyway. You move slow, cautious, every step packed tight before you shift your weight. The trees thicken around you. Pines, heavy with snow, leaning over the trail like old men whispering secrets. You see tracks, barely. Big ones. Moose, elk, maybe bear, though they're supposed to be sleeping this time of year. You follow them higher, then you find him. He's slumped at the base of a tree, wrapped in a fur coat, beard frosted stiff, eyes closed. One hand is clutched around his rifle. The other holds a small leather pouch. His breath is shallow, but he's alive, barely. You kneel beside him, press your gloved hand to his neck. Weak pulse. You say his name. Nothing. You slap his cheek lightly. A grunt. That's enough. You set to work fast. This isn't a rescue. It's a race. You can't drag him. Not all the way back. So you pull him under the tree's natural shelter, build a tiny fire with pine needles and twigs, and pour half your flask into a tin cup. You tip it into his mouth, watching as he coughs and sputters and curses, which is the best thing you've heard all week. He's frostbitten, lips cracked, fingers too stiff to bend. But he's here. Turns out he'd tracked a bull elk up the ridge, lost it, then got turned around in the storm, spent the night under a fallen pine burning his hat for warmth. Said he kept hearing something in the woods too, something big. You don't ask. Everyone hears things when the snow gets deep enough. You help him back down the ridge, slowly, carefully, stopping every few minutes to breathe, curse and remind each other that spring is only a few months away. At the shack you stoke the fire, get him into bed and leave a note in case someone else comes looking. The sun's low when you start the hike back. The wind is calm again. For now, you follow your own tracks home, knowing that they'll be gone by morning. Trappers were lone wolves out here, part myth, part cautionary tale. They lived further out than most, survived on grit and meat and a fondness for isolation. But even they weren't immune to the cold. You always heard about the successful ones, the ones who came back with pelts and stories. You didn't hear about the ones who didn't come back at all. There's a fringe tale about a trapper who made it through 7 winters alone, only to fall through the ice while washing his socks. No one found him until spring. His cabin was full of meat and firewood. He just got unlucky, or maybe too comfortable. You reach your cabin and collapse inside, shedding your coat in a heap. The fire's low, but it's alive. You toss on a log and sit close. The heat crawls into your bones like a slow forgiveness. You pour the last of your flask into a tin cup and sip it in silence. You saved someone today, or at least bought him a little more time. That's enough. Sometimes out here, that's all you get. You've been inside too long. Not the kind of too long that makes you lazy. The kinds that makes your brain start to peel apart in slow layers. You stare at the same warped floorboards, the same knot in the beam above your bed, the same swirl of frost gathering in the corners of the window like it's plotting something. The fire pops once, and you jump like it fired a warning shot. Yeah, it's that kind of day. After enough time in the cold, your body toughens, but your mind frays. Cabin fever isn't a figure of speech out here. It's a diagnosis. You start by talking to yourself, then the stove, then the shadows. You lose track of days, meals blur, dreams get long and strange and too vivid. Sometimes you wake up unsure if you're still dreaming. You counter your canned beans just for something to do, even though you already know exactly how many are left. 17. You're starting to hate beans. So you do what you always do when your head starts sliding sideways. You pull on your boots and step outside. The cold smacks you like it always does, but today it feels almost good. At least it's something. You walk a few slow laps around the cabin, then take the long way to the woodshed, even though you don't need more wood. Not yet. The snow is hard-crusted and slick. Your boots crunch through the surface, leaving deep dents that will freeze over by nightfall. You take your time, breathing slow, watching the horizon for nothing in particular. And it's while you're walking that you remember the old unwritten rules of the mountain men. Not printed anywhere, not carved into plaques, just passed from one frostbitten survivor to the next in half-mumbled wisdom and raised eyebrows. First rule, never let the fire go out. Not even during the day, because you never know how fast the weather might turn. Second, always carry more than one knife, because you will drop one, lose one, or snap one trying to split frozen meat. Third, never trust your mind past the third snowstorm, because that's when things start to whisper to you. You heard that one from a grizzled old man named Elijah at a trading post one year. He wore 6 layers of fur and had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen a moose do something it shouldn't have. He said he'd once spent a winter alone up in the Bitterroots, and after a few weeks of white silence, he started to believe the snow had a voice. He heard it call his name, said it sounded like a woman he used to know, said it told him to lie down, that it would be easier. He didn't, obviously, but he got close. You chuckled when he told you, he didn't. Back in your cabin now, you put another log on the fire and sit for a while, watching it catch. The flames crawl up the bark like they're tired too. You get it, you're tired, but not sleepy, just drained. Worn down from nothing in particular, which is somehow worse than exhaustion. You pass the time cleaning your tools, sharpening the hatchet, oiling the trap springs, checking the seams of your boots for the still 100th time. You organise your supplies, then reorganise them. You read the same 2 pages of the same battered book you've been reading for a month and realise you don't remember a word of it. You set it down. Out here, solitude is a necessity and a punishment. You need it to survive, but too much of it and you start to come undone. There's a reason trappers used to talk to their pelts, name their snowshoes, and build snowmen just to have someone to talk to. Humans aren't built for this kind of quiet. You once heard of a man who carved a face into a pine stump and called it his brother. Shared meals with it, argued with it, and when spring came and the wood rotted out from underneath, he had a full-blown funeral, complete with a sermon and a pine cone headstone. People laughed when they told the story. You didn't, because you're starting to understand it. Some nights, when the wind is at just the right pitch and the shadows on the wall flicker in a certain rhythm, you catch yourself listening. Not for anything in particular, just something. A voice, a knock, a reminder that you're not actually alone, even though you are. And sometimes you're not. There are wolves, bears, things with teeth. But those don't scare you half as much as the thought of losing your grip, losing your schedule, your habits, your rules. That's why you always keep your boots by the fire and your axe within reach. Not because of an ambush, but because those rituals keep the edges of your sanity sewn together. There's a phrase you read once, the wintering mind. It's stuck with you, the idea that after enough weeks in the cold, your thoughts start to mirror the landscape, slow, white, featureless. You don't stop thinking, you just stop noticing what you're thinking about. You start drifting. The danger isn't fear, it's detachment. You get up and open the cabin door again just for a second, the wind gusts in like a bored burglar. You let it hit you, then shut it. Just a reminder, you're still here, still alive, still deciding what gets in. Some folks wrote letters to themselves during the long months, journaled like their lives depended on it. And maybe they did. Others carved tally marks on the walls, counting down to spring like prisoners. You reach up and run your fingers across your own marks, small neat slashes on the underside of the top beam, hidden from sight but not from memory. 42 so far this season. That's how long you've been hibernating. That's how long you've kept your grip. You sit back down, not because you're tired, but because moving too fast might shake something loose. You put your hands near the fire, let the heat soak into your bones. You're not broken, not yet, but winter hasn't stopped trying, and you haven't stopped holding the line. Night settles in without asking permission, slipping down from the hills like it's been waiting for you to blink. 1 minute there's a sliver of pale sky above the tree line, and the next it's just blackness. Cold, still, absolute. You light the lantern by the stove and trim the wick low, not because you're conserving oil, although you are, but because too much light in the dark makes you feel exposed. The shadows feel more honest somehow, more like company than threat. You reach for your mittens and pull them on, then your moccasins, worn smooth on the soles, patched more times than you can count. They're soft now, pliable as old bread, lined with rabbit fur that's thinned in places but still holds a whisper of warmth. You wiggle your toes inside them the way you always do, not to get warm exactly, just to remind your feet they're still part of you. Your coat comes next, buffalo hide, too heavy to wear unless you absolutely have to. But tonight, you do. The wind's dropped, but the cold has deepened in its absence, like the sky inhaled and forgot to exhale. Outside, the stars are brutally clear. You can see Orion's belt stretched over the hills and the Seven Sisters tucked low near the horizon, blinking like they know something you don't. You step out into the night. No plan, no chore, just the need to breathe something that hasn't been filtered through log walls and smoky air. Your breath leaves your mouth in thick plumes, curling up toward the black. Snow crunches underfoot in a way that tells you the temperature has dipped hard. The brittle cold, as some old-timers called it, when even sound feels sharper. You walk a few paces, then stop and tilt your head back. Above you is that impossible, endless sky, the moon fat and low, casting silver light across the snow like spilled milk. And suddenly you understand why people used to chart their lives by it. You could swear you hear it humming, not with music, just presence. Back when the Lakota told stories around winter fires, they spoke of the moon as a listener, a watcher, not a god, not a guardian, just a silent observer of what people do when they think no one's looking. You remember a tale someone once shared about a hunter who got lost in a whiteout and prayed not for rescue, but simply for the moon to keep watching him, so he wouldn't vanish into nothing. You take a deep breath and let it out slowly. You're not lost, but the thought still comforts you. You head toward the tree line, not far, just enough to step out from under the cabin silhouette. Here, away from the hearth, the cold takes a different shape. It wraps around your bones instead of your skin. There's a stillness here that's older than you, older than the land even, and it asks you to walk slower, speak softer. There's something ceremonial about it. This nighttime cold. Not cruel, not exactly, just firm. It reminds you that you're small, that you're temporary, and somehow that makes you feel better. You're not meant to conquer this, you're just meant to pass through. You walk along the edge of the trees, careful not to break the crust of snow where the moonlight hits. Every now and then you hear a twig snap, the brush of a branch, the quiet shifting of some small unseen thing watching you from the dark. You don't flinch. They are not hunting, just noticing. Just like you. And that's the truth about winter on the frontier. Not everyone wanted to fight the cold. Some learned to move with it, through it. They didn't build their homes like barricades. They dressed in layers meant for silence, walked in rhythms that didn't echo, and wrapped their lives in patterns shaped by the weather, not in spite of it. Moccasins were a big part of that. Not just shoes, an entire philosophy of movement. Light, soft, flexible. They let you feel the ground, the snow, the cracks in the ice. You knew where you stood in the world because you could feel it with your feet. Boots stomped, moccasins whispered, and sometimes whispering was the smarter way to stay alive. There's a fringe tale you recall from a northeastern tribe about a man whose moccasins were made from moon shadows. He could walk across snow without sinking, hear the stories buried beneath the ice, step across frozen rivers without falling in. No one ever saw him arrive or leave, they just felt the warmth return once he passed. You know it's just a story, but tonight, under this sky, you can't help but wonder. You turn back toward the cabin slowly. The wind stirs again, not strong, just enough to brush your cheek and remind you your time outside is running out. You step gently, quietly, feeling the give of the snow beneath your feet, listening to the night breathe. You pass a pine tree and hear it creak, a long, slow exhale of frozen wood. It sounds like it's talking in its sleep. When you reach the door, you pause, look back once. The sky hasn't moved. The moon is still watching. The cold is still here, but so are you. Inside, the fire is waiting, low, steady, faithful. You strip off your coat, kick the snow from your moccasins, and set them by the stove to dry. The smell of hide and wood smoke mingles in the air like something sacred. You sit and rub your hands together, then hold them out to the fire. They warm slowly, as if the heat has to earn its way back into your blood. You're not warmer out there, but somehow you feel better, quieter. Like something about standing under the stars in frozen silence rearranged the weight inside your chest. Not lighter, just balanced. You take one last look out the window, where the snow glows faintly under moonlight and the trees stand like sentries. You're ready for sleep now, and maybe, just maybe, the cold is too. By now, you've gotten used to the rhythm of winter. Slow, cold, methodical. You wake, stoke the fire. Count what's left and plan every movement like it might be your last for the day. Not because you're dramatic, but because wasted effort costs body heat. And out here, that's like tossing coins off a sinking ship. But today your stomach has other plans. You've been rationing hard the past week, living off jerky and beans, the occasional boiled root that tastes like despair. But this morning your gut growls with a new intensity. It's not just hunger anymore, it's insistence. You need meat, real meat. So you start gearing up. Not for a full hunt. You don't have the supplies or energy for that. This is more of a recon mission with hope stapled to the back of it. The old snare line you set near the creek bed hasn't been checked in a while, and if anything's gotten stupid or desperate enough to wander into it, well, that's your best bet. You pull on your mittens, your snow-crusted moccasins, and wrap a wool scarf around your neck twice. Then you grab your pack, a hatchet, a skinning knife, and a hunk of salt that you've been hanging onto like a talisman. Salt means survival. Meat without salt is a fleeting miracle. Meat with salt is security, preservation, power. You step outside and blink into the brightness. Last night's moon has given way to a sun that's shining like it means it. Everything sparkles, but it's the kind of sparkle that lies. It's still bone-deep cold. That fresh, deceptive light just makes it prettier to die in. The snow creaks underfoot with every step. You make your way toward the snare line through a stretch of pines that creak and whisper above you. Snow dust falls in gentle sprinkles from high branches. The path is mostly familiar. Your own tracks are half gone, erased by drifts and time, but your feet remember. That's something winter teaches you. Trust your boots more than your eyes. When you get to the creek bed, you pause. The water's mostly frozen over, a thin ribbon of black slicing through the white. And there, by the stand of bent birch, is one of your snares, and it's moving. You hurry over, careful not to slip, and sure enough, a snowshoe hare squirming in the loop, ears twitching, body tense. It's alive, it's panicking, and it's beautiful in that raw, silent way life looks when it's fighting not to disappear. You mutter an apology under your breath, you always do, and finish the job quickly. Clean, respectful. This isn't cruelty. It's the contract you've made with the land. You sling the hare into your pack and check the other snares. One more is tripped, but empty. False alarm. Still, one rabbit means stew. It means broth. It means fat, which is what you need more than anything right now. Out here, the cold doesn't just take your heat. It devours your body's fuel. That's why winter diets were loaded with lard, tallow, salted meat. You need it to keep your internal fire burning. Settlers and mountain folk preserved meat every way they could. Drying, salting, smoking. You remember helping an old trader once build a smokehouse from snow blocks and sticks, a kind of weird frontier igloo where thin strips of deer meat hung above a slow smouldering fire. It worked like a charm. The meat cured slowly, and the snow insulated the whole thing from predators and the worst of the wind. Temporary, but brilliant. You've never built one yourself, not yet, but if this winter drags much longer you might have to. You make it back to the cabin by late afternoon. You're sweating under your layers now, which you know is bad news. Sweat is a traitor in the cold, it soaks into your clothes, freezes once you stop moving, and leaches warmth faster than anything. So the second you're inside, you peel off your coat, mittens and hat and hang them close to the stove. Not too close. You learned that lesson the hard way. Ever seen a mitten catch fire? Smells like regret and sheep. You set to cleaning the hair. The motions are automatic by now. Skin, gut, wash, trim. You stretch the pelt and set it aside, too thin to trade but maybe useful for lining gloves. The meat goes into the pot with some dried onion and the last of your salt. The smell starts to rise almost instantly, and for the first time in days your stomach stops complaining and starts anticipating. And as you sit there watching the pot bubble gently, you think about how much of frontier life revolved around preserving things that wanted to rot. Meat, vegetables, sanity. You dried apples in the fall so you wouldn't forget what sweetness tasted like. You packed root vegetables in sawdust and buried them under the floorboards. You salted everything even when it didn't need it, just in case. The irony, of course, is that outside your door the world is one giant freezer. But that didn't make preservation easy. Food left in the open froze so hard you needed an axe to break it up. You couldn't leave meat outside too long, or wolves would smell it from miles away and show up hungry and entitled. Some settlers buried their meat in snowbanks, marking the spot with sticks or rocks. Some even stored food in hollowed-out tree trunks lined with ice. Ingenious, sometimes stupid. One man you heard about tried keeping a side of venison under his bed in the cabin, thinking it would be just cold enough. It was, until it wasn't. He woke up one night to the smell of rot and the sound of mice having a party under his mattress. The stew's almost ready now, and the smell has changed from desperate to edible to actual food. You ladle out a bowl and blow on it until the steam stops trying to bite you. Then you take a slow sip. It's the best thing you've tasted in weeks, not because it's fancy, just because it's enough. That's the thing about winter on the frontier. You stop caring about comfort, about variety, about seasoning. You care about fuel, warmth, fat, calories. You care about one more day without hunger gnawing on your spine. You set the bowl down and lean back in your chair, closing your eyes for a moment. The fire snaps quietly. The wind has calmed. You're fed. You're warm. And tonight, you don't have to think about tomorrow's hunger. Not yet. Tomorrow, maybe, you'll start planning a smoke rack, or check the snares further down the ridge, or barter for lard from the family across the pass. But tonight you eat like a king of frost. You've heard it said that civilization follows the sound of a piano. And if that's true, then tonight you are absolutely, without question, at the furthest possible distance from civilization. Because all you can hear is wind, the wheeze of your own breath, and the slow groan of old wood trying to decide whether to hold itself together another night. But back in the day, when people managed to carve little towns out of frozen nothing, the saloon was one of the first things to rise. Not a schoolhouse, not a church, not even a proper store, a place to drink and forget the cold. You wrap your blanket tighter around your shoulders and throw another log on the fire, watching the sparks snap like a room full of sarcastic comments. You imagine what it might be like to step into a saloon right now. One of those boomtown watering holes with uneven floors, warped doors, and a barkeep who wipes glasses with a rag that hasn't been washed since the US acquired the Oregon Territory. It would be warm, loud, reeking of sweat and sawdust and too many bodies in too small a space. And yet, somehow, that chaos was survival. Not just the heat from the stove, but the heat from each other. Human bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, laughing, yelling, sometimes punching, but still alive, still moving. Because out here, motion is everything. Stillness belongs to the dead. You reach over to the shelf and pull down the bottle you've been nursing since mid-December. It's not whiskey in the romantic sense. It's closer to something scraped off the floor of a barn and distilled through boot leather. But it burns, and tonight that'll do. You pour a finger into your tin cup and hold it near the fire until it's warm enough to smell vaguely like regret and wood glue. Then you raise it. Not for a toast, really, just because it feels like what someone in a saloon might do. Because frontier saloons weren't just about drinking, they were about surviving the cold with company. You weren't just paying for liquor. You were paying for stories, for distraction, for the illusion that winter couldn't find you if you were surrounded by the laughter. And, maybe more importantly, you were paying for a place where your own silence didn't echo quite so loudly. They were built fast, usually from the cheapest materials possible. Slap together some boards, throw in a bar made from a fallen door, slap a sign outside that said Whiskey 5C, and you were in business. No insulation, no real walls, But they always had a stove, and someone was always feeding that stove like it was a wild animal they couldn't afford to let sleep. Of course, not all saloons were equal. Some were barely better than barns with a poker table. Others had ambitions, red velvet curtains, maybe a piano shipped in from back east that hadn't held a tune since Lincoln. The more successful ones had gambling rooms, upstairs bedrooms, and barkeeps who could handle drunks, cheats, and coyotes with equal finesse. But what tied them all together, from the fanciest boomtown bar to the grimiest outpost shack, was this. They were warm. Warmth meant survival. It didn't matter if the whiskey could peel paint. It didn't matter if the piano was missing keys and the cards were sticky. If the fire was hot and the room was full, you'd made it through one more night. There's a story, fringe, maybe exaggerated, maybe not, about a man who walked 20 miles through a whiteout just to reach a saloon in Leadville. When he got there, he had frostbite on both feet and couldn't speak from the cold. But he pulled out a coin and slapped it on the bar like Moses parting the Red Sea. They gave him a drink, a blanket, and a stool by the stove. No questions, he lived. That's how important saloons were. They weren't luxuries, they were lifeboats. You take another sip, it burns better now. Your toes are thawing, but your fingers still feel like someone else's. You shake them out, stretch, and imagine the sounds of a saloon. Laughter rising in waves, boots stomping in from the cold, the occasional piano note warbling in the background like a drunk bird trying to find its key. You imagine the walls sweating from the heat inside while snow piles up quietly on the roof outside. You've been in places like that. Maybe not often, but enough to remember. One winter, years ago, you spent 4 straight days holed up in a mining town saloon while the pass was blocked. No one could leave and no one could sleep. It was shoulder to shoulder. Miners, hunters, trappers, and a preacher who kept trying to sing hymns over the card games. You played poker with a man who swore he once ate his own boots during a storm in Wyoming. He lost every hand and didn't seem to care. But what you remember most was the heat. It wasn't just the stove, it was the sheer density of life. People crowded together, shouting over the wind, inventing things to stay awake. Someone told a story about a ghost buffalo. Someone else said they'd seen wolves walk on their hind legs during a full moon. You knew they were all lying, and you didn't care, because the cold couldn't touch you in there. Not that night. That's the kind of warmth you can't bottle, can't trade for, can't even properly describe. You set your cup down, half full now, and pull your blanket tighter. You listen to the wind clawing at the corners of the cabin, still angry it wasn't invited in. You imagine a piano in the corner playing something slow and out of tune, just enough to remind you that music exists, that people exist. You think about building a saloon. Not really. You barely have enough wood for firewood, let alone a bar. But maybe you'll make a sign, hang it up over the table, something stupid like Cold Comfort Inn, whiskey, warmth, and wild lies. You smile to yourself, because sometimes surviving winter isn't about what you have, it's about what you pretend you have. And tonight, you've got a drink, a fire, and a saloon full of ghosts. That's enough. Morning takes its time showing up as if it's also sick of the cold and not in the mood to work today. When it finally arrives, it slips in under the edge of the clouds with a grey light that doesn't quite count as sun, but it's the best you're going to get. You sit at the edge of your cot, swaddled in every blanket you own, watching your breath curl like a lazy ghost in the air, and you think, yep, this is the day to do it. The schoolhouse. You promised yourself you'd check on it eventually, just hadn't decided when eventually would feel worth walking a mile through snow that could eat your boots. But today your fingers ache a little less, as the wind isn't slicing you in half, so you pack up a few things, lace your boots tighter than usual, and head out. The schoolhouse sits on a low rise, maybe a half-hour walk from your cabin if the snow's good. It used to be a gathering place back when the settlement still had children running around, and people still believed things like structure and discipline would survive out here. That was before most of the families pulled up stakes and headed toward towns with railroads and grocery stores. Can't blame them. But a few hung on. A few still send their kids to that one-room building with a pot-bellied stove and windows that don't close all the way. You've seen them, tucked like sardines in thick coats, huddled around the heater, while the teacher scratches words on a slate board with frozen fingers. You crest the hill and see it. The schoolhouse squatting like a stubborn memory. Roof crusted in snow, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the stovepipe. Someone's inside, that's a good sign. You stomp your boots on the porch, knock once on the crooked door, and step in without waiting for an answer. The heat hits you like a relieved exhale. Not hot, not even close, but warmer than outside and more importantly occupied. There's the teacher, Miss Elwell, still tough as leather at the 60, and 5 kids, all bundled up, noses red, eyes sleepy. The blackboard is covered in long division that looks like it's been abandoned mid-thought. A teapot rattles gently on the stove. "Just in time," Miss Elwell says without looking up. "You're going to be the guest reader." You laugh. You haven't read anything aloud in months, but you take the book she hands you, something about a bear who bakes pies, and sit in the one empty chair near the stove. The kids shuffle closer, half for the story, half for the heat. As you start to read, you realise your voice is rusty. You don't sound like yourself, but the words come anyway, slow and deliberate, and the children listen with the intense stillness of small people who've learned not to waste energy. And in that moment, you remember something essential. Heat isn't just physical, it's shared focus, shared presence. The stove in the centre of the room is working overtime, ticking and hissing like it's got opinions. Someone stuffed it full of pine logs, and the smell of resin and ash makes your eyes sting. But it's holding. That's the most important part. The battle out here was never between people and snow. It was between fire and space. How much warmth could you trap before it vanished into the corners? Schoolhouses were infamous for being half warm at best. Most had just the one stove, usually in the middle of the room, and whoever sat closest roasted like a ham while the kids by the windows developed the ability to write legibly with mittens on. It wasn't fair, but it was routine, and routine is how you survive winter. Miss Elwell picks up where you leave off when your voice gives out. She's got that way of reading that makes everything sound like truth, even as nonsense. The bear burns his pies, the kids laugh. It's the first sound of actual joy you've heard in days, and it hits harder than the cold ever could. You walk around the room while she reads, inspecting the space with the quiet eye of someone looking for weak spots. There's a crack in one window stuffed with rags, a draught seeping in under the door. A few floorboards bowed from frost, but it's holding, barely. In the back, a metal basin holds water half frozen. The inkwells are dry. The books are tattered, but the flag still hangs by the board, limp but present. And there's chalk. Somehow there's always chalk. You sit back down by the stove and notice one of the kids, Elijah, maybe 7, holding his hands too close to the heat. You reach out and gently guide them back. "Can't feel them anymore," he says softly. You nod. That's how you know it's working. You remember your own days in a winter schoolhouse, not this one, a different state, a different snow, but the same setup. Potbelly stove, wet mittens steaming on the edge, kids trying not to fall asleep during long, droning grammar lessons. You learned 2 things back then, how to copy someone else's multiplication answers without getting caught, and how to tell when a fire was dying just by the sound it made. There's a fringe story about a town in Dakota's territory where the schoolhouse stove exploded during a blizzard. The teacher threw herself over the kids, and they all survived except her. The town built a monument and the school kept going, but the new stove, they chained it to the floor just in case could. You believe it, not because it sounds heroic, but because schoolhouses weren't just about learning. They were the warmest building in town. On some days, that made them more important than any church or store. Some kids walked 5 miles just to get warm for a few hours, and if they learned a little arithmetic along the way, all the better. Eventually Miss Elwell stands and says it's time for handwriting. The kids groan. She pulls out the inkwells and blows gently across the tops, hoping they haven't frozen solid again. You take the hint and rise, stretching your legs. "Day for tea?" she asks. You nod grateful. The kettle whistles like it's happy to be noticed. She pours 2 cups and hands you one. It tastes like pine needles and desperation, but it's hot. And hot matters. You watch the kids work, tongues poking out in concentration, fists balled around pens, letters wobbling across the page. Their fingers are red, stiff, stubborn, and you think this is how the West was really built. Not with 6-shooters and cattle drives, but with frozen ink. One clumsy letter at a time. There's a sound that changes everything. The beat of hooves on packed snow, distant but growing louder, heavier, deliberate. You hear it just as you're closing the schoolhouse door behind you, tea still warming your chest, the laughter of kids lingering in your ears. The rhythm is unmistakable. Not a rider out for a stroll, but someone with a mission. You stop at the bottom of the hill, narrow your eyes toward the horizon, and wait. The rider comes into view a moment later, cresting the rise like he's been cut straight out of a dime novel. Long coat, scarf pulled high, Hat low over his face, reins held tight as the horse picks its way carefully through the drifts. The man doesn't look to either side, just focuses dead ahead, shoulders hunched like he's been fighting the wind for days. You recognise that posture. It's not arrogance, it's exhaustion wrapped in duty. As he draws closer, you see what he's wearing and know right away. He's a frontier doctor. Not because of any medical bag, though it's slung across the saddle. Not because of any shiny badge or sign, but because he looks like a man who's been interrupted. Interrupted from whatever he was doing, whenever he was resting, called out into the cold by someone desperate enough to send for him in the middle of a freezing week. He doesn't stop at the schoolhouse, doesn't glance at you, just gives a quick nod and keeps riding. Heading toward the hollow east of town, you know who lives there. The Thompsons. Big family, 4 kids, one of them sick last time you saw her. The kind of sick where the cheeks burn but the fingers go cold, you feel your stomach drop just a little. You follow on foot, boots punching through the crusted snow with each step. You don't ask why. No one ever let the doc ride alone, unless they had no choice. Not because he needed help medically, most of these frontier doctors were half magician, half mechanic, could stitch a wound while quoting Virgil, but because sometimes he needed someone to hold the other hand. The Thompson cabin is small, sunk into the earth with snow banked high around the base. Smoke curls out the chimney, but it's thin, not good. Thin smoke means the fire's losing. By the time you get there, the doc's already inside. You let yourself in quietly, nod to Mr. Thompson, who's standing near the door, hat in his hands, face pale with fear and fatigue. In the corner, little Elsie lies on a straw mattress, bundled in every blanket they own. Her skin is red and sweaty, her lips dry, eyes fluttering. Fever, too high, the kind that steals breath and reason. Mrs. Thompson kneels beside her, eyes wide. One hand on the girl's forehead, the other clutching a damp rag like it's the only thing keeping her anchored. The doctor's unpacking tools, murmuring instructions, water, clean rags, a needle. He moves with a calm born of too many emergencies, and you grab the iron kettle and swing it over the fire, add snow, stoke the flames, check the door for drafts. Not a nurse, just an extra set of hands. In a crisis like this, every second counts and nobody asks for a resume. There's no penicillin here, no IV drips or fancy machines, just herbs, instinct and experience that's been bought in blood. The doc checks her pulse, then listens to her chest with the kind of intense focus that turns the whole room silent. You see him frown slightly. That's not good. He leans back. She's strong, he says, not looking at anyone. But she needs rest, heat, and a prayer or two wouldn't hurt. That's doctor code for we're not out of the woods. You help Mrs. Thompson rewrap the child in warmer layers, add more blankets, heat a brick by the fire to slide near her feet. Every tiny comfort matters, and through it all, the doc stays calm, focused. You wonder how many times he's done this, how many cold rides, how many sick children, how many parents holding their breath in one-room cabins while he rummages through a leather bag, trying to keep death from getting too comfortable. There's a scholarly debate, you remember, about how effective frontier doctors actually were. Some argue they did more harm than good. Spreading infection, using outdated methods, relying too much on whiskey and leeches. Others say they were the unsung heroes of expansion, holding back the tide of death with nothing but grit and rudimentary science. Both are probably right. Some were quacks, some were miracle workers. Most were just tired people doing impossible jobs with too few tools. And yet they rode. In storms, in darkness, over mountains, across rivers that swallowed better men. They came when called, even if they knew they might arrive too late. Because if they didn't show up, who would? You step outside for a moment to grab more snow for water and feel the full weight of the cold return. It's sharp now, the kind that doesn't just sting, it warns. You hurry back inside, dump the snow in the kettle and close the door tight. By afternoon, the fever starts to break. Elsie's breathing evens out. Her cheeks lose that too red colour. She opens her eyes once, sees her mother, and tries to speak. But the words are too weak. Still, it's something. The doc finally sits down, rolls his shoulders, and closes his eyes for just a second too long. You hand him a cup of lukewarm tea, and he drinks it like it's the finest bourbon on earth. Later, as he wraps his scarf and prepares to ride back into the pale dusk, Mrs. Thompson grabs his sleeve. She doesn't say thank you, doesn't cry, just nods, eyes wide, holding something between relief and disbelief. He nods back. That's all. You walk with him back to his horse, help him tighten the saddlebags, check the saddle. The snow squeaks underfoot, dry, brittle, cold enough to split bark. "She'll make it," he says quietly. "This time." You don't ask how many didn't. He swings up into the saddle, adjusts his scarf, and looks out toward the tree line. Then he says something you'll remember for the rest of your life. "Tell the next one I'm coming." And then he rides off into the blue-grey light, hooves crunching snow, scarf trailing beneath like a flag. You stand there until he disappears, because that's what winter does out here. It isolates, it punishes, it tests, but it also reveals the people who ride anyway. The first thing you notice is the sound, not the sharp howl of winter wind or the shriek of a frozen branch giving way, but something subtler, rounder, almost soft, a kind of slow drip, drip, drip. You freeze halfway through tying your boot and tilt your head. There it is again, steady, in rhythm, almost musical. You throw open the cabin door and are met with a brightness that doesn't burn but glows. The snow is melting, not all of it. Not fast, but enough. The edges of the drifts have softened, the crust has turned to slush, and patches of muddy earth peek through like they've been holding their breath all winter. A slow trickle runs from your eaves, dancing off the porch with that familiar sound. The one that says maybe, just maybe, you made it. You step outside in nothing but your base layers, no coat, no scarf. The air is still cold but not cruel. It doesn't bite, it exhales. Your boots sink in the slush with a thick, wet sigh, and you smile, unprompted, the way you haven't since the first flake fell back in October. You walk out into the clearing behind the cabin and close your eyes. The sun is actually warm, weak and watery as it is. Your skin registers it slowly, as if it's forgotten how to absorb heat from anything but fire. There's a stillness in the trees, but it's not empty anymore. It's expectant. The silence of winter has given way to a hush that feels like a room just before someone speaks. The icicles hanging from the roof are dripping fast now, some breaking loose and falling with a satisfying thunk into the snow below. You hear water running somewhere deeper in the trees, maybe the creek's finally breaking free of its icy shell. And then, faint but real, a bird calls out. Not just any bird, a lark. You actually laugh. Just once. It sounds strange in your throat. It's been months since you heard a sound like that. Back in the day, the first thaw was a sacred moment. Not a celebration exactly, more like a long exhale. Winter didn't end with trumpets and sunshine. It ended slowly, reluctantly, dragging its feet like a sulky child. The thaw was a truce, not a victory, but it still mattered. You trudge around to check the shed. The door's stuck in place, the bottom half frozen in a thick layer of slush and ice. You plant your feet and yank it loose with a crunch and a groan. Inside, the tools are all where you left them, frosted but functional. You count your woodpile without thinking, even though the end of winter means you finally won't need it all. Inside the cabin, everything feels different now. The corners of the room aren't so dark, the frost on the window has retreated to the edges. The fire burns low and lazy. For the first time, you consider letting it die out for a few hours. You take a moment to look around. This little bucket of logs and pine pitch has been your whole world. Your sanctuary, your furnace, your jail cell. And now it looks a little less like a cave and more like a room again. You notice the scratches on the doorframe, the crack in the floorboard, the cup you chipped last month and never bothered to fix. All part of the landscape now. Settlers didn't always make it this far. Spring was a dream they couldn't afford. More people froze to death in March than in January, because March lied. March promised warmth, teased with sunshine, and then killed you with a surprise storm when you let your guard down. But April meant business. April was when the rivers roared back to life and the land remembered how to breathe. You drag your chair out to the porch and sit there, boots kicked up on the rail, face tipped toward the sky. You don't do anything, don't think anything, just sit. And that's when you realise something else. The world smells different. The air carries a trace of thawed pine, damp moss, and the deep earthy scent of rot waking up. You'd forgotten that smell existed. You drink it in like it's soup. Soon the animals will return, shuffling out of hibernation, cautious but hungry. You might spot a bear nosing around, or coyotes trotting through the brush in loose pairs, sniffing for something dead or dying. And then the birds. Not just larks and sparrows, but crows, blackbirds, geese. Noisy, demanding things that don't know when to shut up. You can't wait. And the people too. You'll see them again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not this week, but soon. Neighbours will trudge through the mud with news or barter goods or just stand around swapping weather lies. One of them will bring rhubarb jam. Another will bring something you didn't even realise you missed until it's in your hands. A letter maybe, or a new pair of socks, or a joke too dumb to repeat. You think about the kids at the schoolhouse, how they'll run outside now during recess, pelting each other with the last clumps of icy snow, their mittens soaked and their faces red with laughter. Miss Elwell might even open the windows, just a crack to let the stale air out. That, more than anything, will mean spring is here. You sit there until the sun dips below the trees and the chill starts creeping back in. But it's a different kind of chill now. Not a predator, just a reminder that winter still owns a little piece of the land. You go inside, light this lantern, and toss one last log on the fire. You've survived. Maybe not with grace, maybe not with style, but you're here. You'll still wake up cold some mornings, still have to melt snow for water now and then, still have nights when the wind knocks too hard on the door, but the worst of it is over. You made it. You're not stronger than winter, but you're still standing, and sometimes that's all survival really means. You climb into bed that night with a full belly, a cabin that isn't threatening to collapse, and a quiet kind of calm that only comes after enduring something big and bitter and long. The blankets feel softer than usual. The fire clicks gently in the stove like it's purring. And outside, somewhere under 1,000 stars, the snow is finally giving up the fight. You let your eyes close and your thoughts drift, not into sharp worries or long lists, but into gentle recall. The mail carrier with his frozen moustache, the trapper half buried under a pine, the schoolhouse with its chalk-stained walls and red-nosed kids, the doctor's horse vanishing into the dusk, all of it still humming faintly inside you like coals that don't want to die out just yet. You smile once in the dark. A real one. Not big, not loud, but the kind that says, yeah, that happened, and I was there. In the morning, the snow might fall again, or maybe it'll rain, or maybe for once, it'll just be quiet. And whatever it is, you'll meet it. With warm boots, a sharper knife, and there's a memory of a season survived, one stubborn, frozen, ridiculous day at a time. Because that's the thing about cold. It never lasts forever, and neither do we. But for now, you're here. Still wrapped in wool and wood smoke and the hum of a world that almost froze you out, but didn't. And that's enough. That's more than enough.